XI. January to May, 1863. Chancellorsville. I. After the disaster of Fredericksburg, the Union army went into winter quarters on the north bank of the Rappahannock. The new commander, General Hooker, was a man of fine presence, of great personal magnetism, and had the reputation of being one of the most efficient and successful of the corps commanders. He at once instituted some excellent reforms, which did much to restore the badly shaken morale of the troops. He adopted a system of furloughs, which remedied to a great extent the evil of desertion, which had assumed enormous proportions. He abolished the clumsy grand divisions of Burnside, and reorganized the army corps. He consolidated the scattered squadrons of cavalry into a corps, under General Stoneman. The cavalry corps comprised 3 divisions, under Pleasonton, Averill, and Gregg, and a reserve brigade of regulars under Buford. The infantry now consisted of 7 corps. First, Reynolds; second, Couch; third, Sickles; fifth, Meade; sixth, Sedgwick; 11th, Howard; and 12th, Slocum. Burnside's old corps, the 9th, was sent to Newport News. By the end of April, 1863, Hooker had the largest, the best organized and equipped army ever assembled on the continent. It numbered on paper about 120,000 infantry and artillery, with more than 400 cannon and nearly 12,000 cavalry. From these aggregates the usual deductions should be made, so that it is doubtful if Hooker had over 105,000 men for combat. On the opposite side of the river, the Army of Northern Virginia, under General Lee, numbered about 60,000 men, including 3,000 cavalry. Although so near Richmond, the army was poorly clothed, shod, and fed, in spite of Lee's earnest efforts. The corps occupied approximately the same positions as at the time of the battle of Fredericksburg: Longstreet's on the left and Jackson's on the right. Lee's headquarters were in a camp near Hamilton's Crossing; Jackson's at Moss Neck, 11 miles below Fredericksburg. The great need of rations for the coming campaign had led the Confederate War Department to send Longstreet with 2 divisions for a campaign toward Suffolk, to collect provisions and forage from the territory near the Union lines. This had reduced Lee's available forces by about a quarter, and was poor policy. At the opening of the campaign, therefore, Lee had only the 2 divisions of Anderson and McLaws of Longstreet's corps; and those of A. P. Hill, Rhodes, Early, and Colston, of Jackson's corps. Hooker's plan of campaign was to force Lee to come out from behind his breastworks and fight in the open. To turn his right was very difficult, owing to the width of the Rappahannock toward its mouth, the swampy character of the country, and the practical impossibility of concealing the movement. Hooker therefore decided to turn Lee's left. Stoneman was to start upon a raid against the Confederate line of communications with all the cavalry except Pleasonton's small brigade. Sedgwick, with his own corps and that of Reynolds, was to cross the river below Fredericksburg, and make a demonstration against Lee's right. The 3 corps, of Meade, Howard, and Slocum, under the personal command of Hooker, would cross the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford. Then the Rapidan at Germanna and Ely's Fords marched down the river, and reopened Banks' Ford, thus reuniting the 2 wings of the army. Sickles was to remain on Stafford Heights, ready to reinforce either wing. Couch was to leave 1 division of his corps on outpost at Falmouth, and place 2 divisions on the north bank of the river opposite Banks' Ford. This plan was simple, and should have been successful. The only error was in sending away so large a proportion of the Union cavalry. Stoneman was detained 2 weeks by a heavy storm, which made the river unfordable, and did not get across until the 28th of April. The result was that he did little harm to Lee's communications, and his absence from the battlefield made possible Jackson's turning movement, which defeated the Union army. Hooker felt no apprehension in thus dividing his army in the face of the enemy, as either wing was practically equal to the whole Confederate force. Sedgwick would have about 40,000 men, with the 3rd Corps (Sickles) about 19,000 on Stafford Heights, and 1 division of the 2nd Corps (Couch) at Falmouth. The main turning force under Hooker would also be about 40,000 strong, with 2 divisions of the 2nd Corps, say 10,000 men, at Banks' Ford. If Lee detached any considerable part of his force toward Chancellorsville, Sedgwick was ordered to carry the Fredericksburg works at all hazards, and establish his force on the Telegraph road. The right wing, if not strongly resisted, was to advance far enough to uncover Banks' Ford; but, in case the Confederates were found in force, it was to select a strong position and await attack, while Sedgwick, coming up from Fredericksburg, would assail the enemy in flank and rear. It thus appears that Hooker's ambitious program aimed at nothing short of surrounding Lee and forcing him to surrender. Let us now see how it was carried out. After making several demonstrations at various points, with a view of confusing the enemy, Hooker began his grand movement on the 27th of April. The 5th, 11th, and 12th Corps started for Kelly's Ford under the command of Slocum. The small Confederate guard at the ford was easily dispersed, and by the morning of the 29th the three corps had crossed the Rappahannock on pontoon bridges. On the afternoon of the 30th they reached Chancellorsville, the Fifth Corps having crossed the Rapidan by way of Ely's Ford, and the two other corps by Germanna Ford. As soon as these troops had crossed the Rapidan, the two divisions of the Second Corps joined them at Chancellorsville by way of United States Ford. Hooker himself arrived at Chancellorsville on the night of the 30th. Meanwhile the Fifth and Sixth Corps under Sedgwick had laid 4 pontoon bridges below Fredericksburg, and crossed the river there on the 29th. No resistance, except that of picket forces, had been encountered anywhere, and the first part of Hooker's program had been carried out successfully. In 3 days and a half he had covered 45 miles, crossing 2 rivers, and established a force of 45,000 men on Lee's flank at Chancellorsville. Hooker was naturally elated at his success, and issued a congratulatory order to his troops, in which he said that "the enemy must ingloriously fly, or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle on our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him." But Lee had no idea even of a strategic retreat. Manoeuvre was to be met by manoeuvre, blow by counterblow. At first he had been in doubt as to the meaning of Hooker's movement, and even suspected that it was an advance against Gordonsville and the Virginia Central Railroad. It was not until the evening of the 29th that he received word from Stuart that the Federals had crossed the Rapidan at 2 fords that afternoon. Anderson's division was at once dispatched to Chancellorsville. Note: There's a detailed map on page 210. During the morning of the 30th, Lee learned that Hooker had divided his army, and that one half of it was at Chancellorsville, while most of the remainder was in his front. He at once resolved to attack one of the wings. As his army was concentrated in front of Sedgwick, Jackson at first favored a movement against the Federal left; but after a careful reconnaissance he came to the same conclusion as Lee, that the position was impregnable. A force of 10,000 men under Early was left, therefore, to hold the Fredericksburg lines and contain Sedgwick; the rest of the army was ordered to march to Chancellorsville. Jackson's 3 divisions, under Hill, Rodes, and Colston, numbered about 25,000; Anderson's division of Longstreet's corps about 8,000; and McLaw's 3 brigades of the same corps about 6,000. Thus Lee had in hand less than 40,000 troops to meet Hooker's 72,000 men. To any general but Lee the outlook would have seemed hopeless. The field upon which the battle of Chancellorsville was to be fought was in the midst of a forest of second growth pine and black oak, the original forest having been cut for charcoal many years before. This tract, well named the "Wilderness," was about 14 miles long from east to west, toward the Rapidan, by some 10 miles wide from north to south. It was drained by many crooked brooks, with marshy borders. The soil was poor; farms were scarce, and the few clearings were not more than a rifle shot in width. A terrain less suitable for the manoeuvring of a large army would be hard to find. Infantry could move along with difficulty, and cavalry nowhere, except along the roads. There were a few good positions for artillery, and there was no range for the guns. Chancellorsville was merely a brick mansion situated at an important junction of roads, on high ground, about a mile back from the eastern edge of the Wilderness, with a considerable clearing to the westward. From the house 3 roads ran toward Fredericksburg: the plank road to the right, the more direct old turnpike in the centre, these two roads joining about midway to the city near the Tabernacle Church; and to the left the roundabout river road, which passed near Bank's Ford. East of the Wilderness the country was more open, and it was there that Hooker expected to fight his battle. Accordingly he ordered his columns to move forward on the morning of the first day of May. Slocum, followed by Howard, took the plank road on the right. Sykes' division of Meade's corps, followed by Hancock's division of Couch's corps, went by the turnpike in the center. The two other divisions of Meade's corps, under Griffin and Humphreys, took the river road. French's division of Couch's corps was ordered to march to Todd's Tavern. Before the advance began Sickles came up with the Third Corps, and was left at Chancellorsville as a general reserve, with one brigade guarding United States Ford, and another at Dowdall's Tavern, watching the approaches in that quarter. Hooker's line of battle ran about 2 miles in a northeasterly direction from Chancellorsville to the river, covering United States Ford. To the west, it covered the plank road for about 3 miles, ending in a short offset to the north. The front was protected by entrenchments hastily constructed. Anderson, on his arrival the previous day, had taken a strong position at Tabernacle Church. When Jackson, marching since midnight, arrived about 8 o'clock on the morning of the 1st, he found that Anderson had entrenched his whole front from near Duerson's Mill on the right to the unfinished railway on the left, about 3 miles. The position effectually blocked all of the roads by which the Federals would have advanced beyond the forest, and there were 40,000 Confederates to hold it, with 100 guns and Fitz Lee's brigade of cavalry. But Lee could not afford to rest on the defensive. Only Early's small force of 10,000 men was in the lines at Fredericksburg to keep the Federal left wing, under Sedgwick, from falling upon the Confederate rear at Tabernacle Church. Therefore, at the same hour that Hooker began his advance, Lee's army also moved forward. Anderson was in advance, with one brigade on the turnpike, and 2 on the plank road; his 2 other brigades and McLaw's division followed on the turnpike; and Jackson's corps of 3 divisions marched on the plank road. The fronts of the two armies soon came in contact on both roads. The Federals, says Doubleday, were almost out of the thickets, and the general line, on the whole, was a good one, for there were large open spaces where the artillery could move and maneuver. Sykes, however, had been directed to advance only to the first ridge beyond the forest; and there he maintained his line until ordered to withdraw to his original position. Slocum's corps had not become seriously engaged when he, too, was directed to fall back. Griffin and Humphreys had advanced nearly 5 miles along the river road, entirely unopposed, and were within sight of Bank's Ford when the orders for the countermarch reached them. "Up to the moment of the withdrawal of his troops," says General Alexander, "Hooker's campaign had been well planned and well managed, and its culmination was now at hand in the open field, as he had desired. By all the rules of the game a victory was now within his grasp." Yet at this early stage of the engagement, "Fighting Joe" seems for once to have lost his nerve; and in spite of the protests of his amazed and indignant corps commanders, he ordered his forces to withdraw to Chancellorsville. For this Hooker has been very severely blamed, and it is not too much to say that these orders lost him the campaign. The Confederates felt that there was something mysterious about so easy a victory, and pursued with great caution, fearing a trap. At length, late in the afternoon, Hooker's tactics became clear. It was evident that he was standing fast on the defensive in a position of great natural strength. As the nature of the country rendered a night attack hazardous, Lee halted his troops, and formed a line of battle in front of Chancellorsville at right angles to the plank road, extending on the right to the mine road, and to the left in the direction of Catherine Furnace. Hooker's position at Chancellorsville was about 5 miles in length, reaching from Scott's Dam, on the Rappahannock, to Talley's Farm, on the turnpike. The left of the line was held by Meade. Then, at an angle, and facing more nearly east, came Couch's corps. French's division covering the junction of the roads at Chancellorsville, and Hancock's division in an advanced position several hundred yards in front. Next came the 12th Corps, Slocum, formed around the crest of Fairview Hill, and facing south. Then there was a gap in the line of about 800 yards beyond which Howard's corps, en echelon along the plank road, held the right of the line. The Third Corps (Sickles's) was kept in reserve back of the mansion. On the morning of the 2nd, 2 brigades of Birney's division of this corps and 2 batteries were placed in the gap between Slocum and Howard, with a strong line of skirmishers thrown out in front. The 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry picketed the roads and kept the enemy in sight. Although the Federal position was very strong in some respects, it had several marked defects. The almost impenetrable thickets made manoeuvring difficult, and gave little scope to the artillery. Besides, and most important of all, the right of Howard's line was "in the air," that is, it rested on no obstacle. Hooker was aware of this weakness, and sent 1 brigade of the Third Corps with a battery to strengthen the line. But Howard declined this assistance, as being a reflection on the bravery of his troops or on his own military skill. As Howard had recently been appointed to the command of the 11th Corps, Hooker did not like to offend him by any action which might imply lack of confidence, so the order was countermanded. During the night of the 1st, a council of war was held at Hooker's headquarters. Some of the generals favored an early assault, others a strictly defensive attitude. Hooker himself wished to contract and thus strengthen his lines, but was deterred by Howard's opinion that his position was impregnable against any assault. He would send his compliments to the whole rebel army if they lay in front of him, and invite them to attack him. 3 miles down the plank road, under a grove of oak and pine, Lee and Jackson, for the 4th and last time, laid their plans for the overthrow of their enemy. If Hooker was still in position in the morning, he was to be attacked. The situation admitted of no other course. The Federal army was divided, the right wing involved in a difficult country, and so favorable an opportunity might never occur again. News had come from Fitz Lee, who commanded the cavalry on the extreme Confederate left, that Hooker's right wing was in the air. Lee's only chance was to cross the enemy's front and get in the rear of this exposed flank. The attempt would be both difficult and hazardous, and failure meant absolute destruction. If defeated, retreat would be impossible. But no risks appalled the heart of Lee either of odds or position, or of both combined. His supreme faith in his army was only equaled by the faith of his army in him. The decision once made, immediate preparations were begun for the movement. Wilcox was sent with his brigade to hold Banks' Ford. This was a wise precaution, for after midnight on the 1st Hooker ordered Reynolds to leave Sedgwick and march with his corps to Chancellorsville. It will be remembered that the divisions of Griffin and Humphreys, after arriving within sight of Banks' Ford on the afternoon of the 1st, had been recalled. Therefore, Reynolds, on reaching the ford after sunrise on the 2nd, found Wilcox's brigade occupying the trenches, and was forced to continue his march to United States Ford, where he crossed. The 4 remaining brigades of Anderson and the 3 of McLaws, of Longstreet's corps, were ordered to entrench during the night. The turning movement was to be made by Jackson with his 3 divisions, his own artillery, and Alexander's battalion of Longstreet's corps. Fitz Lee, with his cavalry, was to precede the infantry and cover the flank. Lee himself was to remain with Anderson's and McLaws's troops, and contain the enemy while the long march of 14 miles was made. 2 hours after sunrise, Lee, standing by the roadside, watched the head of the column march by, and exchanged with Jackson the last few words ever to pass between them. The division of Rhodes led the column, Colston followed, and A. P. Hill brought up the rear. The sun rose on this day, the 2nd of May, about 5 o'clock, and set a little before 7. There was a full moon that night. Moving in a southwesterly direction, Jackson struck the Brock road, a narrow track which runs nearly due north, and crosses both the plank road and the pike about 2 miles west of Howard's position. The Brock road, which would have been strongly held by the Union cavalry if Stoneman had been present, was free and unobstructed. Couriers brought word that the trains in the rear had been attacked and forced off the direct road; that some of Hill's brigades had turned back to save them, and that the enemy in great strength had poured into the gap between the 2 Confederate wings, but still Jackson pressed on without a look behind him. About 2 o'clock, just as the rear brigades, after checking Sickles's attack on the trains, were leaving the Welford House, 6 miles distant, Jackson himself reached the plank road, where he purposed to turn eastward against the Federal flank. Here he was met by Fitz Lee with the important information that by attacking down the turnpike, instead of the plank road, he could take the Union line in reverse. Having satisfied himself by a personal reconnaissance that this was correct, Jackson at once changed his plans. The cavalry, supported by the Stonewall Brigade, was sent a short distance down the plank road to mask the march of the column. At 4 o'clock Rhodes was on the pike, where he was joined by Jackson. Marching down the road about a mile, in the direction of the enemy, the troops were ordered to halt and deploy for battle. Meanwhile, seated on a stump near the Brock Road, Jackson wrote his last despatch to General Lee: General: The enemy has made a stand at Chancellor's, Dowdall's Tavern, which is about 2 miles from Chancellorsville. I hope as soon as practicable to attack. I trust that an ever kind Providence will bless us with great success. Respectfully, T. J. Jackson, Lieutenant General. The leading division is up, and the next 2 appear to be well closed. T. J. J. General R. E. Lee. Without their presence being suspected by a soul in the Federal army, 25,000 Confederates were now deploying in the forest directly in the rear of the Union lines, and overlapping them both, to north and south. Chapter 12. June to July, 1863. Gettysburg. After the battle of Chancellorsville, the two armies resumed their former positions on the opposite sides of the Rappahannock. The morale of the Union army had suffered from another defeat, while the Confederate hopes, in the words of General Alexander, reached the highest point attained during the war. Under the system of obligatory service, Lee's army was at once increased by a large force of conscripts. He was also rejoined by Longstreet with his 2 divisions, which had been absent during the Chancellorsville campaign. On the 31st of May, Lee had an army of over 76,000 men and 272 guns. At the same date, the Army of the Potomac was reduced by loss in battle, and by expiration of the terms of service, to less than 105,000 effectives. Although there were few men then endowed with the foresight to realize the fact, the next 5 weeks were to mark the turning point of the war, and the fate of the Confederacy was to be decided by the policy adopted by the Southern leaders at this time. Grant, with 75,000 men, had at Pemberton, with 30,000, securely invested at Vicksburg, while Johnston, with less than 25,000, was at Canton, powerless to raise the siege. Unless Johnston could be heavily reinforced, or some measure taken to force the Washington government to recall a part of Grant's army, Vicksburg was doomed, and the Mississippi would be lost to the Confederacy. On the 15th of May, Beauregard suggested to Johnston a plan to submit to the War Department for a brilliant summer campaign. And about the same date, Longstreet, when passing through Richmond on his way to rejoin Lee, outlined to Mr. Seddon, the Secretary of War, a very similar project. This plan, in brief, was to take advantage of the interior lines of the Confederacy to transfer Longstreet's 2 veteran divisions, 13,000 strong, via Lynchburg, Knoxville, and Chattanooga, to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where Bragg, with some 45,000 Confederates, confronted Rosecrans with about 60,000 Federals; to send Johnston's 25,000 from Mississippi, and Buckner's 5,000 from Knoxville to the same point; then for Lee to go west, take command in person, defeat Rosecrans, and march on Louisville and Cincinnati. "If anything could have caused Grant's recall from Vicksburg," says General Alexander, "it would have been this. Surely the chances of success were greater, and of disaster less, than those involved in our crossing the bridgeless Potomac into the heart of the enemy's country, where ammunition and supplies must come by wagons from Staunton, nearly 200 miles, over roads exposed to the raids of the enemy from either the east or the west. In this position, a drawn battle, or even a victory, would still leave us compelled soon to find our way back across the Potomac." But foreign intervention was the ruling idea with President Davis, and he declined to entertain the proposition. After reporting to General Lee, Longstreet made him the same suggestion. "He reflected over the matter several days," said Longstreet, "and then fell upon the plan of invading the Northern soil, and so threatening Washington as to bring about the same hoped for result." What might have been the result of the acceptance of this plan, which was strategically sound, is a problem of great interest; but it is doubtful whether the result for the Confederacy would have been any more satisfactory than the campaign which Lee actually conducted in the East. At that time Mr. Davis was very sanguine that a victory on Northern soil would bring about foreign recognition; and Lee himself was averse to leaving Virginia; also to any division of his army. Ever since the failure of the invasion of Maryland, both Lee and Jackson had longed to try it once more, and during the winter and spring the latter had prepared a remarkable large scale map of the country from Winchester to Susquehanna, on which even the farmhouses were noted, with the names of the owners. In preparation for the coming campaign, Lee decided to reorganize his army, making 3 corps instead of 2. General James Longstreet, a native of South Carolina, remained in command of the First Corps. He had the unbounded confidence of his troops, who called him "Old Pete," and was considered the hardest fighter in the Confederate service. Jackson's old corps, the Second, was assigned to General Ewell, who was entitled to the command by reason of his rank, services, and ability. Lee wished to place the new Third Corps under the command of a Virginian, although this made it necessary to disregard the claims of 2 officers who had been very efficient. He accordingly selected for the command of the Third Corps, General Ambrose P. Hill, passing over the 2 generals next in rank, D. H. Hill, a native of North Carolina, and McLaws, a Georgian, against whom there was no objection, except that they were not Virginians. General Longstreet thinks that this reorganization somewhat impaired the morale of the troops. General Alexander also states that D. H. Hill had strong claims for promotion, and that Stuart would have made a more active and efficient corps commander than Ewell. Each corps consisted of 3 divisions, and each division of 4 brigades, except Anderson's and Rodes', which had 5 each, and Pickett's, which had 3 at Gettysburg; in all 37 infantry brigades. The cavalry, which comprised the select troops of the Confederacy, were now organized as a division, consisting of 6 brigades, under Stuart. At this time the general artillery reserve, commanded by Pendleton, was broken up, chiefly due to the lack of guns, and was never reestablished. Pendleton, however, was retained as chief of artillery. The new artillery organization, of a few batteries with each division, and a reserve with each corps, but with no general reserve for the army, was the first of the kind ever adopted, and it was subsequently copied by all the principal nations of Europe. But General Alexander thinks that the fine service of the Federal Reserve of 110 guns, under Hunt, at Gettysburg, demonstrates the advantage of such an organization in every large army. The 3 Confederate army corps, of from 21,000 to 23,000 men, approximated in numbers what is today considered the proper strength of an army corps, that is 30,000 men; and each corps only lacked a complement of cavalry to make it a complete little army in itself, which is also the approved organization of today. Lee was a full general; his corps were commanded by lieutenant generals, his divisions by major generals, and all but 2 of his 42 infantry and cavalry brigades by brigadier generals. Nearly all of these officers were veterans of proved ability, and many had served in the Mexican War. In the Army of the Potomac, on the other hand, the average strength of the army corps and divisions was about half that of the Confederates. At the battle of Gettysburg the 7 army corps consisted of 19 infantry divisions, of which 7 had 2 brigades, 11 had 3, and 1 had 4; in all 51 brigades. The army and the corps were commanded by major generals, the divisions by 3 major generals and 16 brigadiers, the infantry brigades by 22 brigadiers and 29 colonels. It is impossible to understand or explain the aversion of the Congress to bestowing proper rank upon the general officers in the United States Army. Since the Revolutionary War, there had been only 4 full generals in our service: Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Pershing. Washington was only a lieutenant general, and Scott until after his retirement held the same rank only by brevet. During the 4 short years of the existence of the Confederacy, 8 full generals and 23 lieutenant generals were commissioned. Their armies were always commanded by full generals, and their army corps by lieutenant generals. "It will be perceived by comparison," says General Hunt, "that the organization of the Army of the Potomac was at this period in every way inferior to that of its adversary. The army corps and divisions were too numerous and too weak. They required too many commanders and staffs, and this imposed unnecessary burdens on the general in chief, who was often compelled to place several army corps under the commander of one of them, thus reproducing the much abused 'grand divisions' of Burnside under every possible disadvantage. Had the number of infantry corps been reduced to 4 at most, and the divisions to 12, the army would have been more manageable and better commanded; and the artillery, without any loss, but rather a gain of efficiency, would have been reduced by a dozen or 15 batteries." Lee's movement began on the 5th of June, and on the 8th the corps of Longstreet and Ewell were concentrated at Culpeper. Hill remained at Fredericksburg to watch Hooker and keep him quiet as long as possible. On the 5th, Hooker wrote the President that he thought Lee was contemplating another invasion of the North, and asked instructions. In their replies, both Mr. Lincoln and General Halleck advised Hooker to attack Lee's column on the north side of the river, and by no means to cross the Rappahannock to assault his intrenchments. In the President's letter he uses the famous illustration of the "risk of being entangled upon the river, like an ox jumped half over a fence, and liable to be torn by dogs front and rear, without a fair chance to gore one way or kick the other." As a matter of fact, the Army of the Potomac, under a competent commander, stood in no danger of being caught "half over the fence," and could have attacked Lee's movable column, or assaulted his intrenchments, with equal impunity. But the Administration had lost all confidence in Hooker since the battle of Chancellorsville. Since Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June, 1862, his career had been one of almost uninterrupted success. His victories on his own soil had been extraordinary, and he had become convinced, like nearly all of his officers and men, that he and his army were invincible. Over and over again, in the Peninsula, at Second Manassas, at Chancellorsville, he had showed contempt of his foe. In his second invasion of the North he displayed the same contempt. No other construction can be placed on the stretching of his line from Fredericksburg to Winchester in the face of an opponent who greatly outnumbered him. On the 14th of June, President Lincoln wrote Hooker: "If the head of Lee's army is at Martinsburg, and the tail of it on the plank road between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the animal must be very slim somewhere. Could you not break him?" "War," says Colonel Henderson, "is more a struggle between 2 human intelligences than between 2 masses of armed men." The great general does not give his first attention to numbers or position, but puts himself in his opponent's place, and observes the situation with that commander's eyes, taking into consideration his weakness, tactical, strategical, and political; detecting the points for the security of which he is most apprehensive; divining what his action will be if attacked here or threatened there. Looking at things thus from an enemy's point of view, he decides whether or not apparent risks can be taken with impunity. It was through his knowledge of the character and position of Mr. Lincoln, the Commander in Chief of the armies of the United States, that General Lee well knew that a threat against Washington was morally certain to result in the recall of Hooker's army for the protection of the capital, and that there was little danger of an attack on Hill. This is why he ventured to distribute his army corps along so wide a front. In order to obtain information as to the enemy's position and proposed movements, Hooker ordered Pleasonton, who was now in command of the cavalry, to beat up Stewart's camps at Culpeper, and gave him 2 small brigades of infantry, 3,000 men, which raised his total force to about 11,000. These troops were in echelon along the railroad, which crosses the river at Rappahannock Station, and runs thence 10 miles to Culpeper. About midway is Brandy Station, and here the 2 cavalry forces came in contact on the 9th of June. After an indecisive battle lasting all day, Pleasonton withdrew, but not until he had secured sufficient information to report to Hooker that 2/3 of the enemy were at Culpeper preparing to move on Washington. The affair was of importance chiefly from the fact that it was the first true cavalry battle fought during the war, and that it enabled the Federals to dispute the superiority hitherto claimed by and conceded to the Confederate cavalry. On the 10th of June, Ewell left Culpeper for Winchester, where he arrived on the 13th. He then pushed on to the Potomac, crossed the river, and occupied Hagerstown and Sharpsburg. The Union forces in the Valley withdrew before the enemy's advance, the garrison at Harper's Ferry being the last to cross the river to Maryland Heights; and on the 17th the Shenandoah Valley was cleared of Federal troops. On the night of the 13th, Hooker started for Manassas Junction, on his way to the Potomac, which he expected to cross near Leesburg. A. P. Hill's corps immediately followed toward the Valley, crossed the mountains to the south of Longstreet, who had left Culpeper on the 15th; then marched down the Shenandoah, and reached Shepherdstown on the 23d. Longstreet marched along the east side of the Blue Ridge to cover the passes, but finally crossed to the Valley and followed Hill to the Potomac. Their columns united at Hagerstown on the 25th. These movements were all screened by the cavalry thrown out on the flanks of the two armies, so that it was impossible for either commander to obtain much information. Hooker crossed the Potomac at Edwards Ferry on the 25th and 26th. On the 27th the First and Eleventh Corps under Reynolds occupied Middletown and the South Mountain passes. The 12th Corps was near Harper's Ferry, and the four other corps were at Frederick. Lee's objective was Harrisburg, and Ewell, continuing his march, reached Carlisle and York on the 28th. The same day Hooker ordered Slocum, with the 12th Corps, to march to Harper's Ferry, there unite with the force at Maryland Heights, cut Lee's communications, and, in conjunction with Reynolds, operate on his rear. In a council held after the battle of Chancellorsville, Mr. Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck had decided that Hooker should not be entrusted with the conduct of another battle. He could not be removed immediately, however, as he still had the strong support of the Chase faction, who refused to consent to a change in the command of the Army of the Potomac unless Hooker should voluntarily resign. Halleck now interposed and refused to allow the withdrawal of the troops from Maryland Heights, although Hooker pointed out that the position was of no possible importance. Hooker appealed in vain to the President and Secretary Stanton. Finding that he had lost the support of the government and that he was not to be allowed to manoeuvre his own army in the presence of the enemy, on the 27th of June Hooker tendered his resignation. This was just what Stanton and Halleck had been scheming to bring about, and his request to be relieved was immediately granted. Major General George G. Meade was appointed in his place, and took command at Frederick on the 28th. Meade was an excellent corps commander, and a safe choice, but he, too, was lacking in aggressiveness to make a good general in chief. He had a disagreeable disposition, and was not popular with his fellow officers. Meade was succeeded in the command of the Fifth Corps by Major General George Sykes, a veteran of the Mexican War and a distinguished soldier. The Union army was now organized as follows: First Corps, Reynolds; Second, Hancock; Third, Sickles; Fifth, Sykes; Sixth, Sedgwick; 11th, Howard; and 12th, Slocum. The seven corps averaged about 12,000 men, making a total of 84,000 infantry. There were about 5,000 in the artillery, and 15,000 cavalry, an aggregate of 104,000. Lee had about 66,000 infantry, divided almost equally between the three corps of Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill; and about 10,000 cavalry under Stuart, who were not present at the opening of the battle of Gettysburg. With the consent of Lee, on the 24th of June, Stuart had started on another of his famous rides around the Union army; but this time his raid was a total failure, and his absence probably lost Lee a victory at Gettysburg. He finally rejoined the army on the second day of the battle, with his horses worn out and his men utterly exhausted. At the time Meade assumed command, the situation was briefly as follows: The advance of Lee's army, under Ewell, was at Carlisle and York, threatening Harrisburg. Longstreet's corps was at Chambersburg, and Hill's between that place and Cashtown. Meade's army was in and around Frederick. Owing to the absence of Stuart and the failure of his scouts to report, Lee did not yet know that the Federal army was across the Potomac. But about midnight on the 28th the famous spy Harrison appeared at headquarters with the news that Hooker had crossed the Potomac, and had been superseded by Meade. He was also able to give the approximate positions of 5 of the 7 Federal corps. This news caused an immediate change in Lee's plans. On the 29th, orders were sent recalling Ewell and directing a concentration of the 3 corps at Cashtown, 8 miles west of Gettysburg, where he hoped the enemy would be forced to attack him. At the same time Meade was laying out a line behind Pipe Creek in northern Maryland, where he, too, hoped to fight on the defensive. The administration at Washington at last seemed to have learned some wisdom from experience. Halleck wrote Meade that he would "not be hampered by any minute instructions from these headquarters," and that he was "intrusted with all the power and authority" which the government could confer on him. Accordingly, as soon as Meade took command, he had abandoned Hooker's plan of operating against Lee's rear, and selected the line Emmitsburg Hanover for the front of his army, with Westminster as his base, in order to force Lee to battle before he could cross the Susquehanna. This line covered both Baltimore and Washington. On the 30th of June the Union troops occupied the following positions: Buford's cavalry division was at Gettysburg; Reynolds was at Marsh Run; Sickles at Bridgeport; Slocum at Littlestown; Howard behind Reynolds at Emmitsburg. These troops, with Kilpatrick's cavalry division at Hanover, composed the first line. In second line were Hancock at Uniontown, Sykes at Union Mills, and Sedgwick at Manchester, with Gregg's cavalry division covering the rear at Westminster. Note. A detailed map of their positions can be found on page 238. On the same day Lee's army was thus situated: 2 of Ewell's divisions were at Heidelsberg, and the 3rd at Greenwood; 2 of Longstreet's were at Fayetteville, and the 3rd, Pickett, at Chambersburg, guarding the trains. One of Hill's divisions, Anderson, was back at the mountain pass on the Chambersburg road, and the 2 others had reached Cashtown and Mummersburg. On the 30th of June, Heth, in command of one of Hill's divisions, heard that shoes could be obtained at Gettysburg, and ordered Pettigrew's brigade to go there and get them. But on approaching Gettysburg, Pettigrew found Buford's cavalry just occupying the town, so he withdrew about 5 miles and bivouacked. This chance collision suddenly precipitated a battle, unforeseen and undesired by either party. Buford realized the importance of Gettysburg as a strategic center, and made his dispositions to hold it if possible. He established his outposts to the west and north of the town, and sent word to Reynolds and Meade. The town of Gettysburg lies in a small valley surrounded by low hills. From the town 12 roads run to every point of the compass. 10 miles to the west the horizon is bounded by the South Mountains, through which lay Lee's line of retreat in case of defeat. About a half mile west of the town is an elevation called Seminary Ridge, from the Lutheran seminary standing on it. This ridge begins at a commanding knoll nearly a mile and a half north of the seminary, called Oak Hill. From this point the ridge runs in a southerly direction, and is covered with open woods. The Chambersburg pike and the Hagerstown road pass over the ridge, and meet at an acute angle at the end of one of the streets on the western edge of the town. Parallel to the pike, and 200 yards north of it, was an unfinished railway. Directly north of the town the country is low and flat, and is traversed by Rock Creek. About a half mile south of the town, facing Seminary Ridge, is Cemetery Hill, rising 80 feet above the level of the valley below. The position which was occupied by the Union army on the 2nd and 3rd days of the battle is shaped like a fish hook. The shank is formed by Cemetery Ridge, which connects the Round Tops on the south with Cemetery Hill on the north. The line then curves to the east and again to the south to Culp's Hill, which corresponds to the point of the hook. The total length is about 3 miles, and the distance from Seminary Ridge is from 1,400 to 1,600 yards. Round Top rises about 330 feet, and Little Round Top about 220 feet above the bed of Plum Run on the west, Culp's Hill about 170 feet above Rock Creek on the east. Both of the extremities of the line were strong, and capable of defense against superior numbers. Cemetery Ridge is not high, and the slopes are gentle. The distance of the point of the hook from the shank was little more than a mile, so that any point attacked could be readily reinforced. Troops could move from one part of the line to another out of view of the enemy; and the reserves were sheltered by the rocks and hills. So long as Culp's Hill on the north and the Round Tops on the south were held, the position could not be outflanked. The weak point of the position was Cemetery Hill, which presented a salient where the line could be enfiladed, and the enemy could approach from the north and west under shelter to within a few hundred yards of the intrenchments. Of this part of the line General Alexander says: "Briefly, the one weak point of the enemy's line, and the one advantage possessed by ours, was never apprehended. This salient offered the only hopeful point of attack upon the enemy's entire line. It would not be too much to say that an attack here on the morning of the 2nd of July would have succeeded." Some 500 yards west of Seminary Ridge, the land rises gradually to another ridge, which is wider, smoother, and lower than Seminary Ridge, and which also begins at Oak Hill. Beyond this second ridge, Willoughby Run flows south to Marsh Creek. The roads to Chambersburg and Hagerstown cross the run about a mile apart. About 5 o'clock on the morning of the 1st, Hill, with the divisions of Heth and Pender, started from Cashtown for Gettysburg, 8 miles distant. At dawn, Buford had made arrangements to entertain the enemy until General Reynolds could reach the scene. He dismounted his 2 cavalry brigades, 3,100 men, and deployed them beyond the second ridge along Willoughby Run. About 10 o'clock, Heth advanced to the attack, with Pender close behind. Although greatly outnumbered, Buford kept the Confederates back for half an hour, until Reynolds arrived on the ground, with Wadsworth's division of his corps, which was immediately deployed along the ridge. The cavalry then took post on the flanks. Almost at the beginning of the engagement, Reynolds was shot through the head, and instantly killed. "The death of this splendid officer," writes Fitz Lee, "was regretted by friend and foe." And, borrowing the words of another, he adds: "No man died on that field with more glory than he. Yet many died, and there was much glory." About 11 o'clock the other 2 divisions of the First Corps came up, with 4 more batteries. Rowley's division and the guns were placed in the line, which was thus extended to the right along Seminary Ridge. The 3rd Division (Robinson) was posted in reserve at the Seminary. Howard arrived at noon ahead of his corps, and assumed command by virtue of his rank. When the 11th Corps came up, an hour later, Schurz, who was in temporary command, was ordered to prolong the line of the First Corps to the north on Seminary Ridge, with his own division and that of Barlow, and place the 3rd Division (Steinwehr) at Cemetery Hill in reserve. Before these arrangements were completed, Buford's cavalry brought word that Ewell's Confederate corps was approaching by the Heidelsberg road, directly on the right flank and rear of the Federal position. Thereupon Howard ordered the 11th Corps to change front to the right, and take up a line across the valley to the north of the town, in order to hold back the enemy. At the same time he called for aid from Slocum and Sickles, whose corps were between Gettysburg and Emmitsburg, from 5 to 10 miles away. Up to this time the Federals had been quite successful, as they were superior in numbers at the actual points of contact. "Whether from discipline or the inspiration of home," writes General Alexander, "the fighting done by the Federal brigades was of the best type." Archer was captured, with several hundred of his men, and 2 regiments of Davis's brigade were cut off and made prisoners. Ewell's 2 leading divisions were soon at hand, and he deployed his troops facing south on a line about 2 miles and a half long, from the Hunterstown road on his left to the Mummersburg road on his right. He had been directed by Lee not to bring on an engagement, if the enemy was in force at Gettysburg, until the remainder of the Confederate army was up. Howard's dispositions were bad, as he attempted to hold a line too long for his small forces, and his right was in the air. Ewell placed a battalion of artillery on Oak Hill, which opened fire on both angles of the Union line, enfilading the left wing, and forcing the right end back to Seminary Ridge. The reserve of the First Corps, Robinson's division, was ordered to reinforce this part of the line, one brigade facing west and the other north. By this time Hill's corps was coming up on the Chambersburg road, and attacking the Union left, while Ewell was assailing their right with overwhelming numbers. Schurz called on his reserve, Steinwehr, for assistance, and tried to cover the town. But the Confederate attack was overpowering. About 3 o'clock the whole Union right gave way, and the troops were driven back to Cemetery Hill with the loss of some 5,000 prisoners. This retreat uncovered the Federal left and made its position untenable. Accordingly, Doubleday gave the command for the First Corps to fall back to Cemetery Hill. Note: the map on page 242 shows their positions on July 3rd. Wadsworth's division went to Culp's Hill, and the two other divisions were posted on the left of Steinwehr, whose position became the rallying point of the Union troops. The two other divisions, Schurz and Barlow of the 11th Corps, were placed at the right of Steinwehr. Barlow himself had been severely wounded, and fallen into the hands of the Confederates. About 3 o'clock Hancock arrived on the scene and took command, under orders from General Meade. He at once gave orders to establish a line of battle on Cemetery Hill. Soon after 2 o'clock General Lee arrived on Seminary Ridge. Seeing the flight of the Federals through the town, he sent a staff officer to Ewell with orders to press the pursuit, and, if possible, secure possession of the heights. But he took no steps to see that the order was obeyed. Sunset was about 7:30. Twilight was long, and the moon was full. But Ewell for some unknown reason failed to continue the pursuit, and made no attempt to carry the heights. As General Alexander remarks, this was another striking illustration of the danger of giving conditional orders, and then failing to follow them up. If the Confederates had been prompt, they might have carried Cemetery Ridge before the Federals were able to occupy it in force. Nevertheless, the battle of the first day at Gettysburg was a Confederate success. About 1 o'clock, Meade, at Taneytown, hearing that Reynolds was killed or badly wounded, ordered Hancock to go in person to the front, assume command of the First (Reynolds) and 11th (Howard) Corps, and of the Third (Sickles), then at Emmitsburg. Also, if he thought the position better than Pipe Creek to fight a battle, so to advise him, Meade, and he would order up all the troops. General Warren, the chief engineer on Meade's staff, arrived soon after Hancock, and going over the ground together, they came to the conclusion that if the position could be held until night, it would be the best place for the army to accept battle, if attacked. The 12th Corps, Slocum, arrived between 4 and 5 o'clock, and was placed in line with the other troops already on the ground. Hancock then sent an aide to Meade to say that he could hold the position until night. He added that the position at Gettysburg was a very strong one, and he left it to Meade to decide whether the battle should be fought there or at Pipe Creek. Between 5 and 6, Slocum himself arrived, and Hancock, after transferring the command to him, returned to Taneytown. During the afternoon, Longstreet had joined Lee on Seminary Ridge, and surveyed the Union position. He said to Lee, "We could not call the enemy to a position better suited to our plans. We have only to file around his left, and secure good ground between him and his capital." To his surprise, Lee replied, "If he is there to morrow, I shall attack him." Longstreet answered, "If he is there to morrow, it will be because he wants you to attack him." Late in the afternoon, Lee had a long conference with Ewell, Early, and Rodes. Ewell obtained permission to send Johnson's division to occupy Culp's Hill, a half-mile to the east of the town. But Johnson found the Federals in possession of the hill, and was not strong enough to attack this almost impregnable position. Nevertheless, says General Alexander, the division was allowed to remain until the end of the battle, and as long as it remained absent, the task before the remainder of the army was beyond its strength. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. 12. June to July, 1863. Gettysburg. Part II. The field of the second and third days of battle at Gettysburg has already been described. The key points of the strong defensive position occupied by the Union army were Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the two Round Tops. The line as finally occupied was about 4 miles long. Its convex form gave it the advantage of interior lines of operation. The only weak point was the salient, already mentioned, where the apex of the line rested on Cemetery Hill, which was exposed to an enfilading fire from the town and its flanks and suburbs. Note: a map showing their positions can be found on page 244. Meade arrived in person about 1 o'clock on the morning of the 2d, and at daybreak rode over the field, assigning his troops to position. By noon, all of his army was on the field except the Sixth Corps, Sedgwick, which arrived during the afternoon, nearly exhausted after a continuous march of 34 miles from Manchester. As finally arranged, the Union line was formed as follows: One division, Wadsworth, of the First Corps held Culp's Hill, with the 12th Corps, Slocum, to the right. Along Cemetery Ridge were the 11th Corps, Howard, the two other divisions of the First Corps, Reynolds, now commanded by Newton, the Second, Hancock, and the Third, Sickles, which prolonged the line to the Round Top on the left. The Fifth Corps, Sykes, was in reserve near the point where the Baltimore pike crossed Rock Creek. On its arrival the Sixth Corps, Sedgwick, was also held in reserve back of the Round Tops. The artillery reserve and the ammunition trains were parked in a central position from which roads radiated to various sections of the line. The right flank was covered by the cavalry divisions of Gregg and Kilpatrick, and the left by Buford. But on the morning of the 2d, Buford was sent to Westminster to escort the trains, and the left of the line, through some error, remained uncovered until Kilpatrick was sent over from the right the next morning. At the base of the steep western slopes of the Round Tops flows a small marshy stream, Plum Run, beyond which, at a distance of some 500 yards, rises another wild and steep hill known as the Devil's Den. From Cemetery Hill, the Emmitsburg road runs southwest along a low ridge past the Peach Orchard, which lies just at the foot of the slope from Devil's Den, about a half-mile west of the lowest part of Cemetery Ridge. Sickles, on finding the part of the line assigned him, just north of the little Round Top, to be lower than the ground in front of it at the Peach Orchard, asked leave to move his corps forward to the higher position. While General Hunt was examining the forward position, Sickles, without awaiting an answer to his request, took the grave responsibility of ordering his line to advance to the Emmitsburg road. He placed Humphreys' division along the road, with its left at the Peach Orchard, and Birney's division on the ridge from the Orchard to Devil's Den. No troops were posted on the Round Tops. On the afternoon of the 2d of July the forces were practically all up on both sides, and the two armies faced each other across the valley between Cemetery Hill and Seminary Ridge. Meade had nearly 90,000 men, and Lee about 70,000. "Except in equipment," writes General Alexander, "I think a better army never marched upon a battlefield." "With such soldiers," says Mr. Rhodes, "if Lee had been as great a general as Napoleon, Gettysburg had been an Austerlitz, Washington and the Union had fallen." It was Lee's intention to attack the enemy as early as practicable on the morning of the 2d, but much time was consumed in reconnoitering the Union position, and it was 11 o'clock before his orders were issued. General Alexander says: Anderson's division of Hill's corps was directed to extend Hill's line upon Seminary Ridge to the right, while Longstreet, with Hood's and McLaw's divisions, should make a flank march to the right and pass the enemy's flank, which seemed to extend along the Emmitsburg road. Forming then at right angles to the road, the attack was to sweep down the enemy's line from their left, being taken up successively by the brigades of Anderson's division as they were reached. Ewell's corps, holding the extreme left, was to attack on hearing Longstreet's guns. Pickett's division was still at a distance, but Longstreet's other divisions, Hood and McLaw's, with the exception of one brigade, Law, had bivouacked only 4 miles from the field. Longstreet set his men in motion at daybreak, but they halted on the way, and lost time in trying to find a route out of sight of the Union Signal Corps on Little Round Top, also in waiting for Law to come up. These incidents caused the loss of 2 or 3 hours, and it was about 3 p.m. when Hood's division, in the advance, crossed the Emmitsburg road about 1,000 yards south of the Peach Orchard. The center of Lee's line was held by Hill's corps, with Anderson at the right, Pender on the left, and Heth in the rear, acting as a general reserve. Ewell's corps was on the left; Rodes' division in the town; Early's between the town and Rock Creek; and Johnson's east of the creek, under Culp's Hill. Stuart was still absent, and Lee had only a few squadrons of cavalry on the extreme left. The Confederate artillery opened fire at 3 o'clock against the two sides of the angle at the Peach Orchard, but it was about 4 o'clock when Hood advanced to the attack. The fault of Sickles's position was now obvious. No force can hold its ground when attacked on both sides of a right angle. Sickles's force had both its lines enfiladed by batteries, to the south and west, and had to yield. Each side of the angle was taken in flank, and the position was untenable. About this time, Warren, who was inspecting the Union left, discovered that there were no troops on Little Round Top, the key of the position. He sent a request to Meade for a division to hold that point, and also asked Sykes, whose corps was moving to the support of Sickles, to detach 2 brigades and a battery to Little Round Top. The 2 brigades arrived just in time to drive back the right of Hood's line, which, after seizing Round Top, was on the point of occupying the other elevation. A fierce combat now ensued for the possession of Peach Orchard. Hood was wounded, and Law, who took command of the division, finally got possession of Devil's Den. Longstreet and Meade both hurried up reinforcements. The Federals were driven back with severe loss, and followed across the wheat field up the slopes of Little Round Top. Then other forces sent by Meade came to the rescue of the imperiled Union line, and the enemy was slowly driven back. Several other Confederate attacks were repulsed, although one brigade, Wright, actually gained the crest of Cemetery Ridge, before it was forced to retire from lack of prompt support. This ended the battle of the second day on the right of the Confederate line. The faulty salient of Sickles at the Peach Orchard had been crushed in, and the defenders driven back to the main Federal line, which was still intact. Only 11 Confederate brigades, 8 of Longstreet's and 3 of Hill's, had been engaged, while Meade had sent 20 brigades to reinforce that part of his line. Hill and Ewell, although ordered to cooperate with Longstreet's attack, had confined themselves mainly to an ineffective long-distance cannonading of the Federal intrenchments in their front. Johnson made a demonstration against Culp's Hill, but refrained from attacking. 2 brigades of Early's division carried a part of the Union line on Cemetery Hill, but were not supported, and were soon forced to withdraw. The result of the day is accurately summed up by Lee. "We attempted to dislodge the enemy, and although we gained some ground, we were unable to gain possession of his position." At 8 p.m., Meade telegraphed Halleck: "The enemy attacked me about 4 p.m. this day, and after one of the severest contests of the war, was repulsed at all points." In brief, the small success of the Confederates was due to a succession of tardy, isolated, unsupported attacks, which showed very poor management on the part of Lee and his 3 corps commanders. On the Union side, Warren and Humphreys distinguished themselves. Sickles was struck by a cannon ball that caused the loss of a leg, and was borne from the field. General Alexander finishes his account of the day with the words: "Thus ended the second day, and one is tempted to say that thus ended the battle of Gettysburg. For of the third day it must be said as was said of the charge of the 600 Balaclava, 'Magnificent, but not war.'" Nevertheless, in the Union camp that night the feeling was one of gloom. On the first day the First and 11th Corps had been badly shattered. On the second day the Third, the Fifth, and part of the Second had been used up, and were not in good condition to fight; only the Sixth and 12th Corps were fresh. The army had lost nearly 20,000 men. Soon after the fighting had ceased, Meade called a council of war, and put the question in writing: "Should the army remain in its present position, or take up some other?" All voted to remain and await another attack. As the council broke up, Meade said to Gibbon, who was in temporary command of the Second Corps: "If Lee attacks to morrow, it will be on your front; because he has made attacks on both our flanks and failed, and if he concludes to try it again, it will be on our center." Meade had been very unjustly criticized for directing his chief of staff to prepare orders for retiring to Pipe Creek in case it should become necessary. About midnight, Geary's division of the Twelfth Corps, which had been withdrawn from the extreme right of the line, returned to its former position, and was surprised to find its trenches occupied by a part of Johnson's Confederate division. This position enabled the Confederates to take the Federal line in reverse. Before dawn, Ewell reinforced Johnson with one of Early's brigades and two of Rodes's. Some other changes were made on both sides during the course of the night, but on the whole the two armies occupied about the same positions as at the close of the battle on the second day. Longstreet held the rocks and woods of the Devil's Den, the bases of the Round Tops, and the Wheatfield; and had possession of the Emmitsburg road at this point. Lee believed that, with proper concert of action, and with the increased support that the artillery could give the columns from the positions gained on the right, ultimate success was possible. He accordingly decided to continue the attack. The general plan was unchanged. Longstreet, reinforced by Pickett's three brigades, was to assault the Union center, while Ewell was to attack the right at the same time. General Lee was aware that Cemetery Ridge was strongly held from one end to the other, but after a careful reconnaissance of the enemy's position, he concluded that the weakest point of the line was at the angle where it approached nearest to the Emmitsburg road, about half a mile south of the intersection of that road with the Taneytown road. If the Confederate assaulting column could pierce the Union line at this point, it would take the entire right of the position in reverse. Owing to the convexity of their line there, the Federals could not support the position by a cross artillery fire, either from the right or the left, and their troops could not fire into the backs of the victorious Confederates without endangering their comrades on the right as much as their foes. So Lee decided to make his assault at this point, and directed Longstreet to carry it out. Longstreet, who had not been in full accord with Lee since the opening of the campaign, protested against this plan of a frontal attack. He said that "the column would have to march a mile under concentrating battery fire, and 1,000 yards under long range musketry; that the 15,000 men who could make successful assault over that field had never been arrayed for battle." But Lee was "impatient of listening and tired of talking," so nothing remained but to obey orders. Before telling the story of the celebrated assault known as Pickett's Charge, which was the event of the last day at Gettysburg, it may be well, however, to give here briefly the outcome of Johnson's battle. The effect of sending him the three brigades from Rodes's and Early, says General Alexander, was "to emasculate the center of our line, and to concentrate 7 brigades where they were utterly useless." Johnson had been ordered to attack at daylight, but was himself attacked by the Federals at that hour. He repulsed the assault, and attempted to follow up his success, but was in turn driven back. Heavy firing was kept up until noon, when he retired to the foot of the hill. In this position he remained unmolested until night, and was then recalled to the west of the town. He lost 1,873 men, which shows the severity of the fighting. The formation of the infantry lines for Pickett's assault consumed a long time, and then the arrangement was one not suited for such a heavy task. For the attack, in addition to Pickett's 3 brigades, Lee assigned to Longstreet 6 brigades of Hill's corps; and one more, Wilcox, of Anderson's division, was added later, making 10 brigades in all. None of these brigades, except Wilcox's, had taken part in the battle of the previous day. The brigades of Garnett and Kemper formed Pickett's first line, with Armistead in second line. In the first line, on the left of Pickett's men, from right to left, were the 4 brigades of Archer, Pettigrew, Davis, and Brockenborough of Heth's division, which was commanded by Pettigrew. Behind the right of these 4 brigades was Scales and Lane in second line. The 6 brigades in the first line comprised about 10,000 men; the 3 in second line about 4,000, and the third line about 1,000. or 15,000 men in all. There was a distance of about 200 yards between the first and second lines. The brigade of Wilcox, which alone formed the third line, was posted in the rear of the right of the column. It was not put in motion until 20 minutes after the rest of the column, too late to be of any assistance whatever. Both flanks of the assaulting column were in the air, and the left without any support in the rear. It was sure to crumble away under fire," says Alexander. The arrangement may be represented thus: Brokenborough, Davis, Pettigrew, Archer Lane, Garnett and Scales, Kemper, Armistead, Wilcox. The front line was more than a mile long; its right was near the peach orchard, and its left near the southern end of an old sunken road leading out of the southwestern angle of the town. The charge was preceded by a heavy cannonading by 115 guns on the Confederate side, replied to by 80 guns of the Federals, whose convex line did not admit of bringing into action a large part of their artillery. At the end of an hour and a half of this bombardment, which did little harm on either side, Hunt, the Union chief of artillery, gave the order to cease firing, as his ammunition was running low. In the morning, Longstreet had taken Pickett to the crest of Seminary Ridge, and pointed out to him what was to be done. Alexander, in charge of the Confederate artillery, was directed to note carefully the effect of his fire, and when the favorable moment came, to give Pickett the order to advance. When the Federal fire ceased, Alexander sent word to Pickett, "For God's sake, come quick, or my ammunition will not let me support you properly." The note reached Pickett in Longstreet's presence. He read it, and handed it to Longstreet, who read it without comment. "General, shall I advance?" said Pickett. Longstreet was unwilling to give the order. He turned in his saddle and looked away. "I am going to move forward, sir," said Pickett, as he saluted and galloped off. It was now about 2 o'clock, and Longstreet, leaving his staff, rode over to join Alexander. "I do not want to make this charge," he said slowly and with great emotion. "I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it now but that General Lee has ordered it, and is expecting it." Alexander felt that on a word of acquiescence from him, Longstreet even then would have countermanded the order, but he was too conscious of his youth and inexperience to express an opinion not directly asked. At this moment, Pickett, at the head of his troops, rode over the crest of Seminary Ridge, and began his descent down the slope. "As he passed me," writes Longstreet, "he rode gracefully, with his jaunty cap raked well over on his right ear, and his auburn locks, nicely dressed, hanging almost to his shoulders. He seemed a holiday soldier." Meade still held the line of the Fish Hook; Slocum at Culp's Hill; Howard at Cemetery Hill; Hancock and Newton now commanding the First Corps along Cemetery Ridge; Sykes and Sedgwick at the Round Tops; Birney, with Sickles's corps, in reserve behind Hancock and Sykes. The point of attack, marked by a clump of trees which has since become famous, was held by Hancock's corps. From a point on the Emmitsburg road, about half a mile from the outskirts of Gettysburg, his line extended about 500 yards along Hay's front, the southern half along a stone wall, which continued westward 100 yards, and then ran south again along Gibbon's front, forming the Bloody Ankle. Here the wall was lower, and surmounted by a country rail fence for about 100 yards to a point directly in front of the clump of trees. South of this there was an ordinary rail fence, which had been thrown down to form the revetment of a shallow shelter trench. Pickett's men had nearly a mile to go to cross the valley. They moved at a walk, keeping their lines accurately as though on parade. Midway, they halted for a short rest in a ravine, which gave them some shelter from the enemy's fire, and then moved on. The infantry had no sooner debouched on the plain than all the Federal batteries opened fire. As the troops drew nearer, they were exposed to the front and slant fire of the Union infantry and artillery, as well as the enfilade fire of the batteries from Cemetery Hill to the Round Tops. Both flanks of the advancing line were shot to pieces, but the survivors crowded in toward the center, and continued to advance. The groans from the battlefield were heard amidst the storm of combat. The slaughter was terrible, but still they pressed on. Stannard's brigade of the First Corps wheeled to the right and attacked the Confederates in flank and rear, adding to the confusion. Armistead leaped the stone wall, waved his sword with his hat on it, shouted, "Give them the cold steel, boys!" and laid his hand upon a gun. 100 of his men followed. The Confederate battle flags were planted on the crest among the cannon they had captured and for the moment held. Armistead was shot down. Garnett was killed. And their men lay literally in heaps beside them. "1,000 fell where Kemper led, 1,000 died where Garnett bled. In blinding flame and strangling smoke, the remnant through the batteries broke, and crossed the works with Armistead." When Armistead fell, the wavering troops seemed appalled, broke their ranks, and retired. The Federals attacked them on all sides and drove the remnants back on the Confederate lines. "The conflict," writes General Alexander, "hardly seemed to last 5 minutes before they were melted away, and only disorganized stragglers were coming back." One of Pickett's brigade commanders, Kemper, was desperately wounded, and the 2 others were killed. 11 field officers were slain, 9 wounded, and only 1 escaped. Pickett himself was not injured, and no member of his staff was killed or wounded. Although he set forth so bravely at the head of his troops, he stopped part way, and never reached the Union lines. 20 colors were captured within a space 100 yards square, and nearly 2,000 prisoners were taken. Out of 5,000 men who went into action, Pickett's division lost nearly 1,400 killed and wounded, and 1,500 prisoners, the total loss being about 60%. The casualties in the 7 other brigades were not reported separately, but were probably nearly as large. Hancock displayed the same reckless courage as the Confederate brigadiers, and seemed to be everywhere, directing and encouraging his men, until he was struck by a ball and fell from his horse. Lying on the ground, he shouted, "Go in, Colonel, and give it to them on the flank." "It is a popular belief," says Colonel Livermore, "that if the gap where Armistead entered had not been closed, Meade's line would have been shattered and the battle lost. But this is far from probable. About 30,000 men were closing around the 3,000 of Pickett's shattered division. If they had forced their way into the mass of troops that was awaiting them, what could they do? Where would they go? Penetrating a hostile line like that on Cemetery Ridge was like entering the jaws of a monster." While Wilcox's brigade was making its charge, General Lee, entirely alone, rode up to Alexander's position near the Emmitsburg road, and remained about an hour. After the charge, he seemed apprehensive of a counterstroke by the Federals, and endeavored to rally the fugitives. He spoke to nearly every man who passed, using such words as, "Don't be discouraged. It was my fault this time. Form your ranks again when you get under cover. All good men must hold together now." While this great battle was raging on the field of Gettysburg, there was a fight between the horsemen of the 2 armies about 2 miles and a half east of the town. Stuart, with 4 brigades of cavalry and 4 horse batteries, endeavored to reach the rear of the Union line, between the York and the Hanover roads. Here he was met by the Federal cavalry, and a combat ensued which swayed from side to side about the Rummel farm. Afterwards the hostile batteries engaged in an indecisive duel, and at nightfall each side held substantially its original ground. About an hour after this fight, Kilpatrick ordered Farnsworth, with 2 regiments of cavalry, to charge the rear of Longstreet's line on the slopes of Round Top. The men rode as best they could, over rocks and creeks, stone walls and rail fences, and were shot down helplessly by the Confederate infantry. Farnsworth was killed, and a large part of his brigade was sacrificed in what has been termed a "hopeless and useless" struggle, which, however, may have prevented Longstreet from supporting Pickett's charge. As soon as the Pickett assault was repulsed, Meade went to the left of the Union line with the determination to attack the enemy. Under his orders, 3 brigades dashed across the wheat field, cleared the woods in front, and captured many prisoners. Longstreet's right fell back to Seminary Ridge. It was then so late in the evening that Meade abandoned the attack which he had contemplated. The next day, which was the 4th of July, Lee concentrated his army on Seminary Ridge, in a position nearly parallel to Meade's center and left. Slocum's corps advanced, and Howard occupied Gettysburg. It rained very heavily during portions of this day, "so violently," says Meade, "as to interrupt any very active operations if I had designed making them." During the night he learned that the enemy had retreated through the Fairfield and Cashtown passes. The losses on both sides at Gettysburg were very heavy. 3,072 Federals were killed; 2,592 Confederates were killed. Federals wounded, 14,497; Confederates, 12,709. Missing Federals, 5,434; and Confederates, 5,150. Total losses for the Federals amounted to 23,003, and for the Confederates, 20,451. No complete returns were ever made of the Confederate losses. Comte de Paris estimates them at 22,728, and Livermore at the much higher figure of 28,063. Meade probably had about 85,000 combat troops on the field, and Lee some 70,000 men of all arms, after making all allowances. On the night of the 3d, Lee decided that he could save his army only by a retreat across the Potomac. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, no supplies of food or forage could be obtained where he was, and there was danger of his line of retreat being cut off by the enemy. On the 4th he started his ambulances by the Chambersburg pike, under escort of a brigade of cavalry. At dark the other train set out by Hagerstown Road, guarded by Hill's corps. Longstreet started next, and Ewell formed the rear guard. The withdrawal was delayed by the heavy storm, and the wounded suffered terribly. As soon as Meade was sure that Lee had begun his retreat on the 5th, he started Gregg's cavalry brigade in pursuit by the pike, and Sedgwick's corps by the Hagerstown Road. The next day the other corps marched by the Emmitsburg road. Finding the Confederate rear guard entrenched in the Fairfield Pass, Meade gave up the direct pursuit, and moved toward the lower passes. On the 8th, Lee's army was near Hagerstown, and the Union forces were between Frederick and Boonesborough. On his arrival at Williamsport, Lee found that the pontoon bridge had been destroyed by Federal cavalry, and the river was so high from the recent rains as to be impassable. He therefore took up a strong position, and began to build a bridge with what material he could find, while waiting for the river to fall. He was in daily expectation of being attacked by Meade. On the 13th, the Union army was in front of Lee's position, but Meade spent the day in reconnoitering instead of attacking. That night Lee's army crossed the river, partly by fording, partly by the new bridge. The second invasion of the North had ended in failure, and Lee had again escaped through excessive caution on the part of the Union commander. It is difficult to see how he could have avoided capture if he had been vigorously pursued and attacked by his adversary. Meade's excessive caution after the battle, for which he has been so severely criticized, is perhaps explained by these words of Colonel Livermore. "In the dread silence which followed the result of the great charge," he writes, "it was hard for the men of the Army of the Potomac to realize that some fearful ordeal was not awaiting them. The memory of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville was fresh in their minds; the great captain had at times been checked before, but never defeated in so great a battle. A false move on Meade's part might turn his victory into defeat." If Lee had been victorious, the result might have been the capture of Baltimore and Washington, foreign intervention, the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States. Meade stood in such awe of Lee, even in defeat, that he was unwilling to take any chances. By remaining on the defensive, and forcing Lee to strike again, or to retreat, he insured the safety of the North. There are many striking points of resemblance between the battlefields of Gettysburg and of Waterloo. On both fields, the hostile armies were drawn up on two parallel ridges, separated by a shallow valley, about 3/4 of a mile wide. The Federal salient at the Peach Orchard, occupied by Sickles on the second day, corresponds to the farm of Hougoumont held by the British at Waterloo. The coterie buildings near the centre of the field are similar to the farm of La Haie Sainte. The chief point of dissimilarity is that the main highway at Waterloo ran perpendicular to the two lines of battle, while at Gettysburg the Emmitsburg road was nearly parallel to the lines. This road was bordered on either side by a 5-bar rail fence which proved almost as formidable an obstacle to the charge of Pickett's men as did the famous Sunken Road at Waterloo to the assaults of Napoleon's Old Guard. When the Confederates reached these fences, they tried to knock them down with the butts of their muskets, but the construction was too solid, and they were forced to climb over, under a heavy short range musketry fire, before continuing their advance. Pickett and his staff rode through the gates into the coterie barnyard on the easterly side of the road, and there they remained until the troops came back in defeat 20 or 30 minutes later. This point was not over 200 or 300 yards from the front of the Union line at the "Bloody Angle." It will always be a mooted question whether Lee was right in deciding to attack the front of the Union position, instead of outflanking it by a move to his right, as advocated by Longstreet. General Maurice, in his recent biography of General Lee, expresses the opinion that Lee was correct in rejecting Longstreet's plan. But there are many reasons for thinking that Sir Frederick is wrong. The most vulnerable point of the Union position was not the angle which Lee selected for his assault on the third day, but the Round Tops at the extreme left of the line. There were no Federal troops on Little Round Top until after 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the second day, and none on Round Top until the following morning. Moreover, Buford's cavalry division, which had been posted near Round Top, to guard the left flank, had been ordered on the morning of the 2d to Westminster, to escort the trains, and had not been replaced by Gregg's division, as General Meade had understood. The left of the line was therefore entirely uncovered. If Lee had gained possession of the Round Tops on the morning of the 2d, as he might easily have done, he would have won a great victory. Not only would the Union position on Cemetery Ridge have been untenable, but the Confederates would have commanded the roads to Taneytown and Littlestown, by which the Federals would have to retreat, in order to cover Washington and Baltimore. The Taneytown road runs at the very foot of the Round Tops, and the Baltimore pike only a short distance to the east. The only routes available for withdrawal would then have been the roads to Hanover and York, running to the east and northeast. Lee's decision to make a frontal attack was all the more remarkable because his two greatest victories, Second Manassas and Chancellorsville, had been won by turning movements, but on both of these occasions he had owed his success largely to the energy and skill of his great lieutenant, Jackson; and he had lost his "right arm" at Chancellorsville. It has often been remarked that after the death of Jackson, Lee never again employed these tactics. If Stonewall Jackson had been in command of the right wing at Gettysburg, instead of Longstreet, the result might have been very different. "Had I had Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg," Lee said to his nephew, "I should have won a great victory." "In war," said Napoleon, "men are nothing. A man is everything." The victory of Gettysburg demonstrated two things. First, that the previous defeats of the Army of the Potomac were due to its leaders, and not to its troops. Second, that the great commander who had so often beaten it was not invincible. As a military genius, Meade cannot be compared with Lee; but his success in this campaign was due mainly to his fine generalship. Lee's repeated victories had led him to believe that he could take great risks in dealing with the Army of the Potomac, and his defeat may be attributed largely to overconfidence. "With that wonderful magnanimity which Lee so fully possessed," writes his nephew, "he took all the responsibility on his own broad shoulders." Wellington is reported to have said that the best general is not the one who makes fewest mistakes, but the one who takes most advantage of the mistakes of his opponent. Like Napoleon, Lee made some mistakes in his campaigns, but no commanders, in ancient or modern times, were more prompt than these two to take advantage of the errors of their adversaries. During the first parts of their military careers they were therefore almost invariably successful; but later, when their opponents had profited by experience, their success was not so marked. At Gettysburg, Lee seems to have been below his usual form; his military genius was under an eclipse. his plan of battle appears to have been dictated by chance, rather than due to mature reflection. Ewell's corps had arrived by the northerly roads from Carlisle and York, and it was left during the battle in and around the town, where it was of little use in deciding the issue of the conflict. Hill and Longstreet, who came up by the Chambersburg road, were placed on Seminary Ridge. Lee's line, concave in form, was fully 6 or 7 miles long, and was held by only 70,000 men; whereas the Union line, convex in shape, was manned by 90,000, and was only about half as long. Then, as stated by Colonel Henderson, Lee's conduct of the battle presents a picture of mismanagement that is almost without parallel in the career of this great commander. On the first day he gave Ewell an order to carry Cemetery Hill, if possible, and then failed to see that his command was obeyed. If the Confederates had gained this strong position before it was held in force by the Federals, there would have been no second and third days at Gettysburg. Meade would have retired to his Pipe Creek line, and the decisive battle would have been fought there. When Lee decided to attack the Union army in its strong position on Cemetery Ridge, he should have concentrated all of his forces on Seminary Ridge, instead of leaving Ewell in the town, and giving Johnson 7 brigades to assault the impregnable Union position on Culp's Hill. As General Alexander well says, in the absence of these troops, the task before the remainder of the army was beyond its strength. On the second day, too much time was wasted in reconnoitering and getting the troops into position. Then the attacks which followed were isolated, and were not properly supported. While Meade sent 20 brigades to reinforce the menaced end of his line, only 11 Confederate brigades were engaged. The 3 divisions of Heth, Pender, and Rodes, and 4 brigades scarcely fired a shot. Nothing was really accomplished except the destruction of the faulty Federal salient at the Peach Orchard, leaving the main Union line intact. The famous assault on the third day, known as Pickett's Charge, was certainly a mistake, as Lee himself admitted later. It had little chance of success in any event, and none at all as made without proper formation, and with no support. After this useless sacrifice of 10,000 of his best men, Lee had no alternative except to retreat, to save his army from destruction. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and no supplies of food or forage could be obtained where he was. The Federal cavalry performed excellent service during this campaign. It constantly covered its own army, and kept in touch with the Confederates, until the 2 forces joined battle at Gettysburg. On the first day of the battle, it held back the enemy of Willoughby Run until the infantry came up. In the opinion of Major Steele, this was the most valuable day's work done by the cavalry in the Civil War. On the third day a part of the Union cavalry defeated Stuart on the right, and prevented him from molesting the Federal rear; while on the left, another part so menaced Longstreet's flank and rear as to prevent him from assailing Round Top with vigor, or detaching a force to aid Pickett. After the battle the cavalry led the pursuit. It destroyed the bridge over the Potomac, and thus delayed Lee's crossing 6 days. It captured wagon trains and hindered the retreat; and 2 divisions attacked the Confederate rear guard just before it passed the river, killing General Pettigrew and capturing about 1,000 prisoners. On the other hand, the Confederate cavalry was allowed, if not ordered by Lee, to make a useless raid around the Union army. Leaving 2 brigades to guard the gaps of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Stuart started on the night of the 24th of June with the 3 brigades of Fitz, Lee, Hampton, and W. H. F. Lee. He expected to make the circuit and rejoin General Lee in Maryland, but the movements of the Federal army forced him so far east that he was obliged to ford the Potomac within 20 miles of Washington on the night of the 27th. Marching northward to Rockville, where he captured a wagon train, he pushed on to Westminster. Finding that the Union cavalry was still between him and Lee, he proceeded across country on the 30th to Hanover, where he had an engagement with Kilpatrick. Encumbered by a useless wagon train, with his men and horses nearly worn out, Stuart was now in a perilous position. He made a night march to York, only to learn that Early had left the previous day. Then he pushed on to Carlisle, to find once more that Early had gone, and that the town was held by a force of Pennsylvania militia. That night he learned that Lee's army was concentrating at Gettysburg, and he set out for that place the next morning, 2nd July. Thus ended a useless raid, which probably cost the Confederates a victory at Gettysburg. Deprived of "the eyes of his army," Lee had been groping in the dark from the time that he started for the Potomac. He told Colonel Long that Stuart's absence had materially hampered the movements and disorganized the plans of the campaign. During the retreat, however, the cavalry did good work in guarding the flank and rear of the Confederate army, and protecting its trains. Chapter 13. September, 1862 to July, 1863. Vicksburg. In September, 1862, the situation in the West was as follows. After capturing Corinth, and dispersing his army, Halleck had gone to Washington to assume the position of General in Chief, leaving Grant in command of the troops in the vicinity of Memphis and Corinth. Grant's forces had been reduced to 42,000 men to reinforce Buell, who was on his way to Kentucky to oppose Bragg's invasion. He was required by Halleck to guard the railway from Memphis to Decatur, 200 miles in length, and to keep communications open with Buell. This, for a time, constrained him to adopt a passive attitude. Opposed to him in Mississippi were two independent commands, each about 16,000 strong. One, under Van Dorn, scattered from Holly Springs to Vicksburg, was charged with the defense of the river. The other, under Price, near Tupelo, was to guard the Mobile and Ohio south of Corinth. Learning that Rosecrans was to be detached from Grant's army to join Buell, Bragg asked Price to attack Rosecrans and prevent this movement. Price accordingly moved on the 14th of September to Iuka, where he expected to be joined by Van Dorn for an advance to Corinth. Grant resolved to attack Price before the Confederate forces were united, and ordered Rosecrans and Ord to march on Iuka. The troops advanced by two different roads, and the movement was not well coordinated. The result was that Rosecrans attacked alone. Darkness ended the battle, and during the night Price escaped. Rosecrans and Ord then returned to Corinth. On the 28th of September, Van Dorn and Price joined forces at Ripley, and the former took command by virtue of his rank. The Confederates advanced to Corinth, where they attacked Rosecrans on the morning of the 3rd of October. By sunset they had driven the Federals into the works at the edge of the town. Van Dorn renewed the assault the next morning, but by noon was defeated after a furious combat, and forced to retreat. Rosecrans made no pursuit until the next day, and the Confederates retired to Holly Springs. General Pemberton was then sent to take the general command of the Confederate forces in Mississippi, and General Rosecrans relieved Buell of the command of the Army of the Ohio. General Grant was now reinforced, and toward the end of October he felt strong enough to attempt the advance on Vicksburg, which he had long had in mind. His headquarters were then at Jackson, Tennessee. His right wing at Memphis, under Sherman, consisted of 7,000 men; his center at Bolivar, under Hurlbut, of 19,000; his left at Corinth, under Hamilton, of 17,500; with about 5,000 more at Columbus, his base under Dodge, a total of 48,500 men. Pemberton had made his headquarters at Jackson, Mississippi, where he had 2,000 troops. Van Dorn at Holly Springs had some 24,000 men, in two divisions under Price and Lovell. Vicksburg was garrisoned by 6,000, and Port Hudson by 5,500; in all, 37,500 men. Grant's plan was to abandon Corinth after destroying the railroads around it; concentrate his forces at Grant Junction, and move upon Vicksburg by way of the Mississippi Central Railroad. But his letter of the 26th of October to Halleck remained unanswered, and it was a full month before he got started. Unknown to Grant, McClernand was then in Washington working out a secret scheme with the President and the Secretary of War, to raise a volunteer army in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, and lead it down the Mississippi to capture Vicksburg. Although he had had no military training, McClernand had handled his division very creditably at Donelson and Shiloh. As an Illinois politician he had long been known to Mr. Lincoln, and he succeeded in winning the President and Mr. Stanton to his plan. To the credit of General Halleck, it must be said that he was not in favor of this scheme. As a professional soldier he realized the defects of a plan which proposed an advance against the same point by two independent expeditions. It was contrary to military principles, ruinous to discipline, and full of the seeds of disaster. To make matters worse, Grant was kept ignorant of the whole scheme, and was so puzzled by Halleck's brief enigmatical telegrams that his own movements were embarrassed. The Mississippi is the most crooked of all the great rivers of the world. In many places it is necessary for a boat to traverse 30 miles to reach a point 10 miles distant from its starting place. The river flows through a soft alluvial soil, in which it cuts new channels to the right or left on meeting the slightest obstacle to its direct course. It is lined by natural dikes, created by the deposits of sediment along the banks, and by artificial "levees," constructed by the people who live along the stream. For 20 miles on either side of the great river, the land is intersected by a network of bayous, or sluggish streams as crooked as the Mississippi itself. The river basin is covered with dense forests of cypress and other trees. In such a country it is manifest that armies could not operate, and that, upon these low flat shores, fortifications could not be erected. But to this rule there were a few notable exceptions. At points like Columbus, Memphis, Vicksburg, Grand Gulf, and Port Hudson, there are bluffs rising from 80 to 200 feet sheer above the turbid stream. Fortifications erected at such points were unassailable from the river. A ship's guns could not be elevated sufficiently to inflict any damage, and the vessels were subjected to a destructive plunging fire. Of all these points along the river, Vicksburg was the strongest. To a fleet it was inaccessible, and to an army nearly so. The city crowns the bluffs at a height of 200 feet above the river, which washes the cliffs for a distance of 11 miles below the place. Grand Gulf is 60 miles, and Port Hudson 250 miles further down the river, but much nearer in a direct line. Between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, the Mississippi was joined on the west by the Red River, the great highway by which the States of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were connected with the central and eastern sections of the Confederacy. Vicksburg and its outpost, Port Hudson, were therefore places of the highest strategical importance. Their capture would cut off the great granary from which the Confederacy was largely supplied with food, and destroy nearly half its power of resistance. The Mississippi between these two points was entirely in the hands of the enemy. The Federal fleet at New Orleans could not pass above Port Hudson, nor the one at Helena go below Vicksburg. No Union army could land on the eastern bank of the river between these two fortresses without being cut off from its source of supplies. Above the city the bluffs swerve in a northeasterly direction, and away from the Mississippi, but near to its tributary, the Yazoo. Here, 12 miles above Vicksburg, the Yazoo washes the base of Haynes's Bluff, which commands all the river approaches. This position, which had been strongly fortified by the Confederates, rendered the city inaccessible from the north. Vicksburg, therefore, could only be assailed from the rear; and here, too, the rugged country, broken by deep ravines, presented formidable obstacles to an enemy. No more arduous task had ever confronted a general than the reduction of this Gibraltar of the Confederacy. By the 5th of November, Grant had reached Oxford, and Van Dorn, under orders from Pemberton, had fallen back to Grenada. As Grant's line of communications by a single track railway back to Columbus, Kentucky, was now more than 200 miles long, he established a secondary base at Holly Springs. The first movement of Grant against Vicksburg was a continuation of the same strategy which had been so effective in the previous campaigns in the West. By moving south on a line parallel to the Mississippi, the river had been conquered all the way from Cairo to Vicksburg. One after another, the series of Confederate strongholds at Columbus, Island No. 10, Fort Pillow, and Memphis had become untenable, and had been abandoned. But now the conditions were different, for reasons which will be explained presently; and the length of the line of communications made a further advance almost impossible. As Napoleon once said, every army, like a serpent, moves on its belly. In the densely populated centres of Europe an army can often live off the country, but this was seldom the case in the South. The food, forage, and ammunition had to be brought to the armies. While the lines were near the great rivers, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Cumberland, the problem was a very easy one, but the insecurity of the railroads rapidly increased with the length from the base, as it was impossible to guard them from the raids of the enemy's cavalry. The weight of food, ammunition, and other supplies required by each soldier averaged 4 pounds daily. The animals necessary for the cavalry, artillery, and trains consumed 25 pounds of forage. In the present century, the problem of keeping an army supplied has been much simplified by the use of motors, but in December, 1862, it required 1,900 wagons, drawn by 11,000 animals, to keep Grant's army supplied at 3 days' march from its base. The army could not travel more than 3 days without shifting its base along the line of some river or railroad. And this base must be securely connected by river or rail with some permanent base established in a region entirely under Federal control. After considerable correspondence, it was finally arranged with Halleck that Sherman should return with one division to Memphis; there pick up the newly arrived troops, and organize an expedition to move down the river to Haynes's Bluff, under escort of Porter's gunboats, while Grant marched his army along the left bank of the Yazoo to the same objective point. Sherman arrived at Memphis on the 12th of December, and started down the river on the 20th. But Grant was prevented from carrying out his part of the programme. Forrest's cavalry tore up 60 miles of the railway north of Jackson, Tennessee, and another mounted force captured the Union garrison at Holly Springs, and destroyed all the Union supplies at that base. Grant was forced to place his army on short rations, and fell back along the railway to a point where he could open communications with Memphis. In the meantime Sherman had descended the river with his force of 32,000 men, and landed at Milliken's Bend, 25 miles above Vicksburg. On the 29th he assaulted the Confederate works at Haynes's Bluff, but was repulsed with heavy loss. The position was held by 12,000 troops sent there by Pemberton, and was too strong to be carried. On the 2nd January, Sherman reembarked his men, and returned to the mouth of the Yazoo. Here he was met by McClernand with an order assigning that general to the command of the expedition. Thus ended in failure Grant's first movement against Vicksburg. Upon assuming command of the Union force near Vicksburg, which he called the Army of the Mississippi, McClernand divided it into 2 corps, under Morgan and Sherman. He then moved his army about 50 miles up the Arkansas River, and attacked Fort Hindman, which surrendered on the 11th of January with 5,000 prisoners. There he was contemplating what General Grant called a "wild goose chase" further into Arkansas, when he was recalled by peremptory order from Grant. Halleck, when informed of McClernand's operation, authorized Grant to relieve McClernand, and supersede him by the next in rank, or to take command of the Vicksburg expedition in person. Grant thought that the easiest way of solving the problem was to assume the command himself, which he did on the 30th of January. He then reorganized the expeditionary force in 4 corps, under the command of McClernand, Sherman, Hurlbut, and McPherson. McClernand protested bitterly over his removal from the command of the Vicksburg movement, but the Washington authorities paid no attention to his complaints. We do not propose to relate here in minute detail the history of Grant's work during February and March. His plans were foredoomed to failure, and except as showing the tenacity of the man, his grim determination to succeed in the face of the most appalling difficulties, the story possesses but few points of interest. A little below the mouth of the Yazoo, the Mississippi turns sharply to the northeast, and after flowing 5 miles in that direction, it makes another equally abrupt bend to the southwest, enclosing a peninsula less than 2 miles in width, nearly opposite Vicksburg. McClernand and Sherman were ordered to set their men to digging a canal across this narrow neck of land. By this passage Grant hoped to transfer his army south of Vicksburg, there cross the river, and attack the town from the rear. This plan was the simplest and apparently the most promising of all. The distance was not much over a mile, but as the canal was designed to admit vessels of 60 feet beam and 9 feet draught, considerable excavation was required. The chief problem, however, was to keep the water out during the progress of the work. After 6 weeks of hard labor success seemed assured when, on the 8th of March, a sudden rise in the river broke the dam, and flooded not only the bed of the canal, but also the surrounding country. From the first, Grant had had but little confidence in this plan, as he had observed that the lower end of the canal would enter the river just opposite the bluffs at Warrenton, a few miles below Vicksburg. Indeed, just before the break occurred, the enemy planted batteries on these heights, which completely commanded the southern end of the canal, so that even if finished, it would have been of little use. Grant's second experiment was carried on simultaneously with the canal work. About 70 miles above Vicksburg, on the west side of the river, there is a remnant of one of the numerous deserted beds of the stream known as Lake Providence. This lake, connected with the Red River by a tortuous system of waters navigable almost the entire distance. By this roundabout route of 400 miles, the ships could avoid the guns of Vicksburg, and bring supplies and reinforcements to the army below the city. McPherson's men were ordered to clear a passage through Bayou Macon, the only point at which the channel was obstructed. As soon as this work was completed, it was proposed to break the levees east of the lake, and let in the waters of the Mississippi; but all the obstacles had not been overcome when Grant abandoned the plan for the one which finally proved successful. The third plan was, to find a passage for the army down the east side of the river, so as to turn the enemy's strong position at Haynes's Bluff. Just south of Helena, about 150 miles above Vicksburg, in a straight line, there is a winding bayou, some 80 feet wide by 30 feet deep, known as the Yazoo Pass. This route in former times had been used by vessels plying between Vicksburg and Memphis. Later it had been closed by a strong levee, 18 feet high and 100 feet thick, because the waters from the river overflowed so much land that they became a nuisance. On the 2nd of February this levee was destroyed by a mine, and the river let into its old channel. But this route was obstructed by the enemy, who felled large trees across the stream, so as to make a formidable barricade. Before this obstacle could be removed, the Confederates constructed a strong earthwork, called Fort Pemberton, in a commanding position on a peninsula where two rivers unite to form the Yazoo. Here they mounted several heavy guns, and completely barred the descent of the river. So this experiment also failed. One more attempt was made, on the east side of the river, to outflank Haynes's Bluff, by utilizing the Big Sunflower River, which empties into the Yazoo 100 miles below Fort Pemberton. But the stream was obstructed by the Confederates, and the transports were attacked by a considerable force. The situation became so perilous that Sherman was obliged to back out. Almost any other commander except Grant would have been entirely disheartened by these repeated fiascos, and have abandoned further efforts. The press was calling for his removal, and he had to do something. Only 3 plans seemed feasible. 1. To assault the Confederate batteries at Vicksburg, which would have been suicidal. 2. To return to Memphis, and renew his attempt along the line of the railway, which presented no greater promise of success than before. Or 3. To find some way of transporting his army to a point below Vicksburg, cross the river there, and attack the town from the rear, without any base of supplies. He chose the third plan. The idea of Grant's final plan was suggested by the success of the gunboats on several occasions in February and March, in running by the dreaded batteries at Vicksburg and Port Hudson. On the 2nd of February Porter sent a ram down; and 10 days later a gunboat also made the passage without any damage. On the 14th of March, Farragut, in his flagship the Hartford, with one consort, succeeded in passing the batteries at Port Hudson, although 4 other vessels were disabled and one destroyed. From this time forth, the Federals were able to close the mouth of the Red River. Having decided upon his course, Grant went ahead regardless of the opinions of his generals. Every one of them, including even the sanguine Sherman, thought that it was sheer madness to cross south of Vicksburg. Having concentrated his army at Milliken's Bend on the 29th of March, McClernand's corps was ordered to lead the way to New Carthage, 27 miles below. By constructing corduroy roads, Grant was able to move his troops and a large part of his supplies by land. On the night of the 16th of April, 10 shiploads of rations and forage, under convoy of the gunboats, made the passage of the forts without serious damage. 10 days later, another squadron ran the gauntlet successfully; and now at last Grant was ready to cross the river. Note. The corresponding map can be found on page 274. The point selected for crossing was Grand Gulf, opposite the hamlet of Hard Times, where the army was concentrated. The fortress of Grand Gulf, on a bluff 25 miles below Vicksburg, formed the extreme left of the defenses of the city. On the 29th of April, the works were bombarded for 5 hours by Porter's fleet, but no impression was made. It was therefore necessary to select another point for the crossing. During the night the fleet, convoying the transports and supply ships, ran by the batteries, and the army marched farther down the right bank. Grant was now informed by a slave that there was a good road from Bruinsburg, 6 miles below Grand Gulf, to Port Gibson, 12 miles inland. The next day McClernand's corps was ferried over the transports, and McPherson's corps immediately followed. In the meantime the attention of the enemy was completely absorbed by a demonstration made by Sherman in front of Haynes' Bluff. He now received orders from Grant to follow the other troops and cross at Bruinsburg. Before continuing the story of the Vicksburg campaign, let us see what the Confederates were doing at this time. At the end of March, Pemberton had in Mississippi about 50,000 troops, scattered at different points. The line from Haynes' Bluff to Grand Gulf was held by 22,000. Port Hudson had a garrison of about 16,000. At Fort Pemberton and neighboring points there were some 7,000; and in the northern part of the State perhaps 5,000 more. All the cavalry had been sent to Bragg, and there was none in the State. On the 17th of April, Grierson left La Grange on his famous raid, and reached the Union camp at Baton Rouge on the 2nd of May. With 1,000 men he rode the entire length of the State of Mississippi, covering 600 miles in 16 days, and destroying many miles of railway and telegraph lines, besides much other property. The Confederates were kept in a wild state of alarm, and far more important than this, their attention was distracted at the most critical moment of the campaign, while Grant was crossing the river. "In its strategic effect," says Major Steele, "this was, perhaps, the most successful cavalry raid of the Civil War." As soon as Pemberton, who was at Jackson, heard of the attack on Grand Gulf, he ordered reinforcements sent there from Vicksburg. By night 2 brigades had arrived, and one of these marched on toward Port Gibson. By daybreak on the 1st of May, this brigade, with one other which McClernand had encountered on his march, was in position in front of the Union corps. The combat opened at dawn. McClernand's whole corps of 18,000 men was soon on the ground, but the country was so difficult to manoeuvre on that it was not easy to beat the Confederates, although they were outnumbered 3 to 1. They finally gave way about 5 o'clock, and retreated to Grand Gulf by 2 different routes, burning all the bridges behind them. Pemberton hastened to Vicksburg, where he spent the following day in sending telegrams in every direction to collect his scattered forces. The Confederates, fleeing from the field of Port Gibson, stopped at Grand Gulf long enough to blow up the magazines and dismount the guns, and then started for Vicksburg by way of Hankinson's Ferry. At the ferry they met 3 brigades sent to their assistance, and were also joined by some troops from Jackson. The whole body then marched to Vicksburg, which the soldiers reached in a more or less demoralized condition. Grant occupied Grand Gulf on the day after the battle, and established his base there. McPherson followed the retreating Confederates to the ferry, and halted there. McClernand bivouacked at Willow Spring. The 2 corps remained in these positions for 3 days, awaiting the arrival of ammunition and rations. Sherman crossed at Grand Gulf on the 7th, and Grant then had his entire force of 43,000 men concentrated on the east side of the river. As previously stated, the forces of Pemberton were very badly dispersed. About 15,000 men were at Port Hudson, a place almost as important to hold as Vicksburg. Over 20,000 men were posted at Vicksburg, and this left only about 15,000 troops available to oppose Grant in the field. Halleck had notified Grant that he was expected to cooperate with Banks in the reduction of Port Hudson and Vicksburg, but that officer was then absent from his headquarters at Baton Rouge in an expedition against the Confederates on the Red River. After crossing the river, Grant received a letter from Banks, stating that he could not get back before the 10th of May. Under all the circumstances, Grant decided that he could not wait. He resolved to advance at once against the railway from Vicksburg to Jackson, so as to place his army between the Confederate garrison in the fortress and the army which it was rumored that the enemy was assembling at the State capital. This was the critical moment in Grant's career, upon which his whole future turned. "To face the difficulties in the way of such a movement," says Mr. Fiske, "required the stoutest of hearts and the coolest of heads." Grant was ignorant of the numbers and the exact positions of his adversaries. Unlike many Union commanders, he was apt to underrate rather than to overestimate the enemy's strength, but he assumed that there were about 30,000 men at Jackson. He had heard that Joseph E. Johnston was on his way from Chattanooga to take command in person, and he anticipated that troops would be rushed from every point to oppose him. His plan was to beat the two hostile forces in detail; first driving Johnston eastward, then turning upon Pemberton, defeating him, and pushing him back into Vicksburg. In order to do this, he must keep his army together; he could not spare any forces to guard his line of communications, and must cut loose from his base altogether, relying for supplies only upon what the men could carry with them, or what they could find in the country. No general ever adopted a more daring scheme. There was no precedent for it in modern warfare. It seemed like defying fortune outright. None of his generals approved of the plan, and Halleck forbade it as soon as the news reached Washington. But Grant was fortunately beyond the reach of the telegraph, and the order did not reach him until success was achieved. Grant began his advance on the 7th of May, as soon as Sherman arrived. His force consisted of the three corps of McClernand, McPherson, and Sherman, about 43,000 men. He had a train of 120 wagons, and the men carried 5 days' rations. Foraging parties were sent out every night to scour the country for food and forage. Grant's movements were admirably calculated to mask his purpose. Small detachments were sent west of the Big Black, to threaten Vicksburg and keep Pemberton in the city. The left wing under McClernand marched up the eastern bank of the Big Black, toward Edwards Station on the Vicksburg and Jackson Railway, about midway between the two cities. The right wing under McPherson was directed toward Jackson by way of Bolton, and, after destroying the railroad and public stores, was to rejoin the main army. Sherman was to follow in the rear of McClernand, or midway between him and McPherson if he could find a road, and within supporting distance of the two wings. It was Napoleon's favorite movement of two wings with a central reserve column. On the 12th of May, McPherson encountered about 5,000 Confederates in a strong position at Raymond, and routed them after a sharp fight of about 2 hours. He then continued his advance on Jackson, supported by Sherman. On the 9th of May, Johnston had received orders at Tullahoma to proceed at once to Jackson, and take command of the forces in Mississippi. On his arrival there, 4 days later, he found the brigades of Gregg and Walker. 2 more brigades, Gist's and Maxey's, were expected to arrive on the 14th. This would give him 15,000 men, but Grant was too quick for him. On the morning of the 14th, Sherman and McPherson were before Jackson. The flank of Gregg's brigade was enveloped by Sherman, and it was forced to retreat. Walker occupied a very strong position, and made more of a fight; but he could not resist the charge of McPherson's troops, and his brigade was soon driven from its trenches. The Confederates escaped by the Canton road, and Sherman and McPherson entered Jackson between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That night Grant slept in the house which Johnston had occupied the night before. On receiving Pemberton's telegram stating that Grant had crossed the river, Johnston replied: "Unite all your troops to beat him." Success will give you back what was abandoned to win it. Pemberton should have advanced to Clinton and attacked Grant in the rear; but he thought that sound strategy required him to seize Grant's line of communications to Grand Gulf. It never entered his head that Grant had done anything so rash as to abandon his base. Accordingly, he wasted his time in marching down toward Raymond. Grant did not tarry long at Jackson. He faced his army to the westward and started for Vicksburg, leaving Sherman to burn the bridges, factories, and arsenals at Jackson, and destroy the railroads for 20 miles in every direction. Johnston had retreated to Canton 30 miles north of the capital. From that place he telegraphed Pemberton on the 16th to march to Clinton, where he expected to unite all his forces. But Grant's army was already at Bolton 10 miles west of Clinton, and it was impossible for Pemberton to comply with the order. On the 15th, Grant marched by the different convergent roads on Edwards Station, where Pemberton was posted with 3 divisions, about 23,000 men. His 2 remaining divisions were at Vicksburg. On the night of the 15th, the lines of the 2 armies were only about 4 miles apart, but neither commander seems to have been aware of the nearness of the other. On the morning of the 16th of May, the Confederates were found in line of battle in a strong position a little south of the railway, about 3 miles west of Bolton. Their left wing occupied the crest of an elevation some 70 feet in height, known as Champion's Hill. The knoll was steep and rugged, and covered with timber on the northern side, but gentler and partly cleared on the eastern and southern slopes. The bald crest was covered with artillery. Pemberton had about 18,000 men to hold his line, which stretched for 2 miles south of the hill. Grant had the 2 corps of McClernand and McPherson. The fighting was almost all done by McPherson's corps and 1 division, Hovey's, of McClernand's, on the Union right, directed by Grant in person. The possession of the hill was stubbornly contested. It was taken and retaken several times. It required 8 hours of severe fighting to dislodge the Confederates. McClernand, on the Union left, practically did nothing. If he had attacked as vigorously as McPherson, the defeated Confederates would have been cut off from the ford over Baker's Creek, on the Raymond road, and been captured. Grant lost about 2,500 men. The Confederate losses were 1,400 killed and wounded, 2,500 prisoners, and all their artillery; while 1 division of 4,000 men, cut off from the rest of the army, fled to the southeast, many miles beyond Jackson. Practically half of Pemberton's army had been destroyed, and the rest retreated in disorder toward Vicksburg. That evening Grant received Halleck's telegram. He had staked everything, but he had won. Vicksburg was doomed. Sherman arrived at Bolton on the night of the battle. Grant took up the pursuit with his entire army at daylight on the 17th. The railway crossing was in a deep bend of the Big Black, and this point was defended by about 5,000 of the retreating Confederates. The head of Grant's column came up about 8 o'clock, and drove the enemy from this position after a fight of less than an hour. The Confederates abandoned 18 pieces of artillery, and 1,750 men were captured. They succeeded, however, in burning the bridge, which delayed the Federals for a whole day. Next day, the 18th, while the 2 other corps marched directly on Vicksburg, Sherman occupied the Benton Road, in the rear of Haynes' Bluff, thus rendering that stronghold untenable. It was immediately abandoned by the Confederates with all its guns and stores, and Sherman had the satisfaction of occupying this fortress which had defied him only a few months before. On the 18th, Pemberton received an order from Johnston to evacuate Vicksburg, if not too late, and save his army. Pemberton called a council of war, which decided that it was too late to withdraw, thus exemplifying Napoleon's maxim, that these meetings always terminate in the adoption of the worst course, which in war is ever the most timid. Pemberton therefore made no effort to obey Johnston's order. Before 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 19th, Grant's 3 corps were in position in front of the city. Sherman's on the right, McPherson's in the center, and McClernand's on the left. Grant thought that the works might be carried by a vigorous assault before the Confederates had recovered from their demoralization. He therefore ordered an immediate attack, but it failed all along the line. Anxious to avoid the long and dreary work of a siege, Grant ordered another assault on the 22d, which also was repulsed. The attack was continued after Grant was satisfied that it could not succeed, because of McClernand's mendacious reports of success on his part of the line. Grant lost over 3,000 men, due largely to these misleading reports of McClernand's. It was now plain that Vicksburg could only be taken by a regular siege, and preparations were begun at once. The ground about the city is much cut up by ravines and small streams, and is admirable for defense. The line of the enemy was about 7 miles long; that of Grant more than 15 miles, extending around the city from Haynes' Bluff on the north to Warrenton on the south. He also had a second line to the east, as a defense against attacks by Johnston in the rear. He had not troops enough at first to man all these works, but Halleck forwarded reinforcements at once. Grant had no siege guns except 6 32-pounders, but Admiral Porter supplied him with a battery of navy guns of large caliber, and with these and the field artillery the siege began. Within a short time Grant had 248 guns in his line, and about 75,000 men in his investing force. Approaches were dug, and mines and countermines set off. On the 1st of July the approaches were all within a few yards of the enemy's works. Orders were issued for a final assault on the 6th. But this was not to be. On the 4th July, Pemberton capitulated, after a siege of 47 days. Grant at first demanded his usual terms of "unconditional surrender," but, for reasons stated in his "Memoirs," later agreed to release the Confederates under parole, and also granted them the privilege of marching out with flying colors to stack arms. With the single exception of Napoleon's capture of the Austrian army at Ulm in 1805, where he took 23,000 men and 60 cannon, there had been no such surrender in modern history. Over 29,000 men laid down their arms, and 172 cannon were taken. Sedan and Metz were in the future. To find a parallel to this campaign, we must go back to Napoleon's first campaign in Italy in 1796. In 18 days Grant marched 200 miles, and with a loss of 4,000 men, defeated 2 armies in 5 engagements, taking nearly 100 cannon, and destroying or capturing 12,000 of the enemy. Including the capture of Vicksburg, he put hors de combat 40,000 Confederates, and took nearly 300 cannon. This achievement by itself is sufficient to put Grant in the foremost rank of the second-rate captains of history, in the same class with Turenne, Marlborough, Wellington, and the Archduke Charles. The capture of Vicksburg, with the simultaneous victory at Gettysburg, marked the turning point of the Civil War. There were still many gloomy days to come, but the final outcome was no longer in doubt. Port Hudson surrendered to Banks 5 days later, and on the 16th a merchant vessel tied up to the wharf at New Orleans after an 8 days' run from St. Louis. In the striking words of President Lincoln, "The Father of Waters rolled unvexed to the sea." At the end of June, Johnston, who had finally succeeded in collecting an army of 25,000 men, advanced as far as Edwards Station. But on the night of the 4th July, on hearing of Pemberton's surrender, he retreated rapidly to Jackson, with Sherman in hot pursuit. Sherman, who had about 30,000 men, refused to attack, but prepared for a siege. Johnston was not to be caught in a trap like Pemberton. On the night of the 16th, he skillfully made his escape, and went into camp midway between Jackson and Meridian. "Not a mistake of strategy can be pointed out in Grant's operations," says Major Steele; "and scarcely a mistake of tactics was made by his subordinate commanders." Grant was fortunate in having 2 such able corps commanders as Sherman and McPherson. During the siege of Vicksburg, McClernand issued a congratulatory address to his corps, full of innuendoes against the other troops and their commanders. It was published in the Illinois papers, and was evidently intended for political effect. In flat defiance of army regulations, No copy was sent to headquarters, and for this act of insubordination Grant sent him home to Illinois, appointing Ord to succeed him. So ended the stormy military career of McClernand. Grant's effective forces during the campaign ranged from 43,000 at the beginning to 75,000 at the close. According to Johnston's reports, his forces at no time exceeded 24,000. Pemberton's greatest available force probably numbered over 40,000. The losses on both sides during the last 2 months of the campaign were as follows: Federals killed, 1,514; Confederates, 1,260; Federals wounded, 7,395; Confederates wounded, 3,572; missing Federals, 453; Confederates, 4,227. Total losses for the Federals was 9,362, and losses for the Confederates 9,059. According to the parole lists on file at the War Department, the number surrendered at Vicksburg was 29,491. End of chapter 13. 14. January to September, 1863. Chickamauga. Part I. After the battle of Murfreesboro, during the first days of January, 1863, Rosecrans occupied the town, and kept his headquarters there until the last week in June. During the same period, Bragg was strongly fortified at Shelbyville and Tullahoma, with his headquarters at the latter place. His cavalry was thrown well north of Duck River, and extended from Spring Hill on the west to McMinnville on the east. Polk's corps was at Shelbyville; Hardee's headquarters were at Wartrace, and his infantry held Hoover's, Liberty, and Bell Buckle Gaps, passes in a range of rough, rocky hills which covered his front toward Murfreesboro. Although the two armies remained practically immobile during this half year, the cavalry on both sides were very active. Each general was striving to cut the other's communications, and the cavalry operations almost assumed the proportions of campaigns. In January an attempt of the Confederates to capture Fort Donelson was repulsed, and their cavalry lost 1,000 men. In April a Union force penetrated far into Georgia, and burned the important Round Mountain Iron Works, but the whole force of 1,500 men was finally captured by Forrest. The Union cavalry was greatly outnumbered by the squadrons of Forrest, Morgan, and Wheeler, and Rosecrans appealed, but in vain, to the War Department for an adequate force. He finally mounted Wilder's infantry brigade on captured horses, and did good work during the campaign. The efficiency of the Confederate cavalry is shown by the report of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for the year ending the 30th of June, 1863. During this period there were but 7 months and 12 days when trains could run over the whole length of the road. Every bridge had been destroyed and rebuilt within the year, many of them several times. The tunnel at Gallatin was choked with rubbish for a distance of 800 feet, and could not be used for days. At times the Federal troops were on half rations; vegetables could not be had in quantity sufficient to keep off scurvy, and forage was scarce. Although possessed of many amiable traits, Rosecrans was very irascible, and was constantly wrangling with Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck. They were continually urging him to move against Bragg, and drive him out of Tennessee, but he always complained that something was wrong which should be righted at Washington. In the spring Halleck hit on a new device for hastening matters. He wrote Grant and Rosecrans offering the rank of Major General in the regular army, as a prize to the first commander who should win an important success. Grant treated the offer with a quiet disdain which was more eloquent than words. But the fiery Rosecrans replied that he felt "degraded at such an auctioneering of honors," and thereby incurred the enmity of the incompetent Halleck, as well as of the despotic and passionate Stanton. Meanwhile, by orders of the War Department, the Army of the Cumberland had been organized into 3 corps. The 14th, under Thomas; the 20th, under McCook; and the 21st, under Crittenden, comprising practically the same divisions which had made up the center, right wing, and left wing during the Murfreesboro campaign. In addition, Rosecrans formed a reserve corps of 3 brigades under General Gordon Granger. The army numbered some 60,000 men, while Bragg had about 43,000. At the same time, East Tennessee was occupied by a Confederate corps under Buckner; and Burnside, at Cincinnati, was organizing the Army of the Ohio for an advance into East Tennessee from Kentucky by way of Cumberland Gap. The last week in June the general situation in both theaters of the war was as follows. In the East, Lee was on his way to Gettysburg. In the West, Grant had Pemberton's army invested at Vicksburg, Burnside was advancing on Cumberland Gap, and Rosecrans at last was ready to move. On the 23d of June Rosecrans issued his orders for the advance. As the Confederate position at Shelbyville was nearly impregnable in front, Rosecrans made only a feint against this point with Granger's reserve corps and most of his cavalry, while he massed his three main corps against Bragg's right at Wartrace. There was some fighting at the Gaps, but the Confederate right was forced back from one position to another, and the left had to retire to keep from being cut off. On the 30th of June the Union army was concentrated at Manchester, and Bragg was forced to abandon his position at Tullahoma. By the end of the first week in July the Confederate army was back in Chattanooga. In a period of 9 days of continuous rain, by brilliant strategy, with the loss of only 583 men, Rosecrans had maneuvered the Confederate army out of its natural and artificial strongholds, and forced it across the Tennessee. Up to this time there had been no strategic campaign so brilliant in plan and execution, and General Rosecrans was warmly congratulated by all his corps commanders, under the lead of General Thomas. Note: You'll find a map on page 286. At the end of the short Tullahoma campaign, the two armies occupied nearly the same positions as the previous year, when the Army of the Cumberland, then under Buell, was preparing for an aggressive campaign against Chattanooga. The Union army was encamped along the western base of the Cumberland Mountains, from Winchester to McMinnville, a distance of 40 miles. As usual, there was soon a feeling at Washington of irrational impatience over what seemed to be the lack of energy on the part of the Union commander. But time was needed to accumulate the supplies of every kind necessary for the campaign; also to acquire information regarding the mountain passes by which the army must move. The railroad by which supplies reached the army also had to be repaired, and this work was not completed until the last week in July. On the 14th of August the advance began. The most direct approach to Chattanooga was by the left over Walden Ridge, a spur of the Cumberland Mountains. The principal objection to that route was that it would necessitate a long line of communications over steep and narrow roads. The only other feasible route was by the right through Bridgeport and Stevenson, and over the mountains of northern Alabama and Georgia. This was finally adopted, because it would keep the army near the railway and its base of supplies, although there stood in the way a number of mountain ranges, hard to climb, and passable only at a few narrow defiles. After crossing the Cumberland range west of the Tennessee, and the river itself, there is a series of mountain ridges, valleys, and streams, generally parallel to the river, on the eastern side. First, there is Raccoon Mountain, which ends in a mass of rough ridges and gorges, enclosed in a deep bend of the Tennessee, about 4 miles west of Chattanooga. Next comes Lookout Valley, beyond which is Lookout Mountain, which ends abruptly 4 miles south of Chattanooga in a commanding point of rock, rising from the edge of the river. From the summit of its steep palisades, 1,400 feet above the swift current of the Tennessee, on a clear day, parts of 7 states can be seen, spread out in a magnificent panorama. Below, on the easterly side, is the valley of Chattanooga, through which flows Chattanooga Creek. Near the mouth of the creek stands the city, superbly situated in the midst of a great amphitheatre of hills. On the further side, the valley is enclosed by Missionary Ridge, which also extends up to the river. 4 miles south of the town, this ridge is traversed by Rossville and McFarland's Gaps, beyond which lies Chickamauga Valley, the scene of the battle. At their upper or southern ends, the valleys of Chattanooga and Chickamauga unite in a single valley known as McLemore's Cove. Beyond Pigeon Mountain and Taylor's Ridge to the east are the towns of Ringgold and Dalton, stations on the railroad from Chattanooga to Atlanta, where Bragg had his base of supplies. The valleys were generally covered with timber, but there were some farms and a few villages. There were no turnpikes, but good country roads through the valleys and the gaps in the mountains. The theatre was somewhat similar to that of Tullahoma, but different from any other in which a campaign had been carried on in this war. The plan finally adopted by Rosecrans was to move his army directly across these formidable mountain barriers, and aim straight at Dalton, where he would be squarely on Bragg's line of communications. This would compel the enemy to evacuate Chattanooga or stand a siege there. The more effectually to mask his movements, Rosecrans kept his left wing under Crittenden thrown out so as to menace Chattanooga from the north. While still keeping up this demonstration, between the 29th of August and the 4th of September, he moved the remainder of his army across the Tennessee, and began his march over Raccoon Mountain. The left under Crittenden took position at Wauhatchie in Lookout Valley; the center, under Thomas, went to Trenton; the right under McCook crossed from Stevenson and Bellefonte to Valley Head, whence cavalry demonstrations were made as far south as Alpine. Meanwhile, the advance of Burnside on Knoxville had caused Bragg to order Buckner to Chattanooga; and he was also reinforced by Walker's corps from Mississippi. At the same time, Lee sent him 2 divisions of Longstreet's corps, and Alexander's battalion of artillery from the Army of Northern Virginia. Owing to Burnside's occupation of Knoxville, these troops had to make a long detour by way of Atlanta, and some of them did not arrive until after the battle. Hardee was detached about this time, and D. H. Hill was sent from Virginia to command his corps. At first Bragg had been deceived by Rosecrans' feints, and was convinced that he intended to cross Walden Ridge, so as to join hands with Burnside. When the Federal plan was finally disclosed, Bragg evacuated Chattanooga on the 9th of September, and marched 25 miles south to Lafayette. But he had no idea of retreating, although he took great pains to give the impression that his army was fleeing in utter demoralization. His object was to cover his communications, and defeat the Union corps in detail, as they debouched from the mountain passes. Rosecrans, in turn, was absolutely deceived. He ordered Crittenden to leave a brigade in Chattanooga to garrison the town, and to pursue by the road to Ringgold. Thomas was directed to advance from Trenton on Lafayette, and McCook from Valley Head to Alpine and Somerville. These orders were issued on the 9th, and it was 3 days before Rosecrans realized his terrible mistake. The 2 wings of the Union army were then nearly 60 miles apart, and Bragg was concentrated opposite the center under Thomas. Bragg was aware of the isolated positions of the Federal corps, and made some efforts to cut them off, but his plans were frustrated by the neglect or incompetency of his subordinates. As already stated, his relations with his officers had not been very cordial since the battle of Murfreesboro. As soon as he understood the situation, Rosecrans acted very promptly. Crittenden was moved from Ringgold to Lee and Gordon's Mill in Chickamauga Valley. Here he was joined by Thomas, who had withdrawn with great skill from the enemy's front, marched along the west side of Missionary Ridge, and passed through Cooper's Gap. McCook, however, was deceived by local guides, who assured him that there was no direct road practicable for his troops to McLemore's Cove; so he retraced his steps over Lookout Mountain to Valley Head, and did not reach the field until the 18th, after a tiresome march of 5 days. If it had not been for this delay of McCook's, Rosecrans would have withdrawn to Chattanooga instead of making a stand at Chickamauga. The delay also gave time for one of Longstreet's divisions to arrive. Therefore Rosecrans was forced to fight, not only in the wrong place, but also against larger numbers. On the 18th of September the Union corps were finally united along the west bank of Chickamauga Creek. The same day Hood's division of Longstreet's corps arrived, and Bragg was informed that McLaws was following closely. He accordingly issued his orders for an attack on the 19th. The order of battle was of the progressive or échelon type, and prescribed that the attack should be begun by Hood on the right, who was to cross at Reed's Bridge, turn to the left oblique, sweep up the creek, and be joined as he proceeded by Walker and Buckner, who were to cross by Alexander's Bridge and Tedford's Ford. Hill was to cover the left flank, but to cross and attack the enemy's right if he attempted to reinforce his center. The cavalry was to protect the flanks, Wheeler on the left and Forrest on the right. The order contemplated turning the left of the Federals and cutting off their retreat to Chattanooga. With this end in view, it was simple and well conceived, but it was based on wrong premises. Bragg thought that the Union center was at Lee and Gordon's Mill, while in fact it was much further north, opposite Alexander's Bridge; and the left under Thomas greatly overlapped the Confederate right. Note: A map of the battlefield of Chickamauga can be found on page 290. The execution of the order therefore departed widely from the course prescribed, as will appear later. 4 miles south of Chattanooga, the highway passes Missionary Ridge at Rossville Gap, where it forks, one branch running east to Ringgold, the other south to Lafayette. About 3 miles south of Rossville, the ridge is crossed by another gap, McFarland's. The battlefield of Chickamauga is an irregular parallelogram, bounded on the west by Missionary Ridge, and on the east by Chickamauga Creek. From the Ringgold road on the north to Crawfish Spring on the south, the distance is about 7 miles in a straight line. From McFarland's Gap on the west to Alexander's Bridge on the east is approximately 4 miles. The road to Lafayette traverses the field from north to south, and crosses the creek at Lee and Gordon's Mill. This road is intersected at a point just north of the Union left by the road from McFarland's Gap, which crosses the creek at Alexander's Bridge. The country is rolling, with some considerable elevations, and at the time of the battle was thickly wooded. There were no villages, but a number of farmhouses. The creek, which runs from south to north, is very winding in its course. Opposite the Federal position there were 3 bridges, Reed's, Alexander's, and Lee and Gordon's, and there were numerous fords. About 3 miles north of the Union left wing, the road to Ringgold crossed the creek at still another bridge, which did not figure in the battle. On the evening of the 18th of September, Colonel McCook, of Granger's Reserve Corps, made a reconnaissance as far as Reed's Bridge, which he burned. Meeting Thomas the next morning, he reported that there was an isolated brigade of the enemy on the west side of the creek, which might be cut off and captured. Thomas accordingly ordered Brannan to reconnoiter the road to Reed's Bridge in search of this brigade. Baird, under orders from Thomas, threw forward his right wing, so as to get in line with Brannan, and a part of Palmer's division, which came up a little later, was placed in position on the right of Baird. Thomas, who occupied the critical point of the line on the left, had been ordered to hold the road to Rossville at all hazards, and had been assured by Rosecrans that he would be reinforced, if necessary, by the entire army. Under Bragg's orders, Walker's corps forded the creek on the morning of the 19th, a little below Alexander's Bridge, and then moved up the creek opposite this point. At the same time, Johnson, of Buckner's corps, crossed at Reed's Bridge, and marched up the stream some 3 miles. About 10 o'clock, Brannan's advance movement encountered the enemy, being the cavalry of Forrest and 2 brigades of infantry, and drove them about half a mile, when it met with obstinate resistance. This reconnaissance of Brannan therefore developed the relative positions of the hostile forces, which had previously been unknown to the 2 commanders. Realizing for the first time that his right was greatly overlapped, and his flank in danger of being turned by the Federals, Bragg halted Walker on his march, and ordered him to retrace his steps. This movement brought on the battle of Chickamauga, before Bragg had his troops in position. Under orders from Thomas, the 2 divisions of Brannan and Baird now attacked the enemy in their front, and drove him back with great loss, taking many prisoners. Here the Union line was halted and readjusted. But before this was completed, Walker assaulted in overwhelming numbers, and drove the Federals back in disorder. Early on the morning of the 19th, McCook was in position at Crawfish Spring, beyond the extreme left of the Confederate army. A little after 10 o'clock, he was ordered by Rosecrans to send the 2 divisions of Johnson and Davis to Thomas. On Baird being driven back, Thomas ordered Reynolds' division of his own corps, and Johnson's division, both of which had opportunely arrived at the same time, to advance and repel the enemy. Walker's corps was attacked on the flank with great vigor by these troops, and driven back to its first position, while Brannan also advanced in front and recaptured the artillery lost when Baird was forced back. Bragg then sent Cheatham to the assistance of Walker, and the two united commands, charging with the "rebel yell," seemed on the point of sweeping everything before them. But at the critical moment Davis reported with his division, and assisted by Wood, checked the Confederate advance. The Union line was reformed, and the divisions of Wood and Davis, reinforced by Sheridan, who came up from the right, then drove the Confederates back again to their first line. Finding that Rosecrans was massing his troops on his left, to hold the road to Rossville and Chattanooga, Bragg placed Polk in command of his right, and ordered uphill from Lee and Gordon's Mill. At about 2:30, the Confederates made another furious assault on the Union line, which pierced the right center and gained the Lafayette road, opposite the Widow Glen house, 3/4 of a mile west of the road where Rosecrans had his headquarters. At this moment, Negley's division came up from the right, and was sent into the fight, with Brannan from Thomas's left. Advancing with loud cheers, these two divisions hurled back Hood and Johnson, and pursued them until darkness ended the combat, the Union troops reoccupying their old positions. After dusk, Thomas prepared to reform his lines for the engagement to be renewed on the morrow, and placed the divisions of Baird and Johnson on his left, with Palmer and Reynolds next, and Brannan to the rear and right of Reynolds, as reserve. While these arrangements were being made, the Confederates assaulted with tremendous force, but were repulsed, with heavy losses on both sides. Minty's cavalry was now ordered to report to Granger, who with his reserve corps protected the road toward Rossville, and guarded the left flank. When the fighting finally ceased, some time after dark, the troops slept on their arms, awaiting the more terrible conflict of the morrow. On the 19th, only Hood, with 3 of Longstreet's veteran brigades, had reached the field, but a little before midnight Longstreet himself arrived, closely followed by 2 more brigades, in time to take part in the second day's battle. The 4 remaining brigades of McLaws and Alexander, with the reserve artillery, were just behind, but did not reach the field in time to turn the evenly balanced scale of the battle. Bragg ordered the battle renewed at daybreak, but under a different organization. The army was now divided into 2 wings, the right under Polk, and the left under Longstreet. To Polk was assigned Cheatham's division of his corps, and the corps of Hill and Walker, with Forrest's cavalry on the right. Longstreet had under him the division of Hindman of Polk's corps, Johnson's division, Buckner's corps, and the 5 brigades of Hood and McLaws, with Wheeler's cavalry on the left. This arrangement was adopted to avoid changing the positions of the troops, but it led to a delay of some hours in opening the battle. Bragg's plan of battle was the same as on the previous day. The whole army was to wheel on Longstreet's left as a pivot, to crush the Federal left, and gain possession of the road to Chattanooga. During the night the Union troops threw up temporary breastworks of logs and rails. At daybreak, Rosecrans rode along his lines, and spent some time in rearranging his troops, particularly in strengthening Thomas on the left. A heavy fog hung over the battlefield during the early morning. Bragg was also up at sunrise, and took position with his staff just in the rear of the center of his line, where he waited impatiently for the attack to begin. Owing to unavoidable delays, 2 hours were consumed in getting the troops even approximately into position, and the first assault was not made until 9:30. For the second day's battle, on Sunday the 20th of September, the lines of the 2 armies were arranged as follows. Baird's division, of Thomas's left wing, extended around the northeast corner of Kelly Field, his left refused. Bordering this field on the east, next came the divisions of Johnson, Palmer, and Reynolds, the right brigade of the latter being in echelon, west of the Lafayette road, its right reaching the Po field. Brannan's front covered the latter field at its western edge. Next came Negley, along the western line of the Brotherton field. Then Davis and Sheridan, in front of the Widow Glen house, with Wood and Van Cleve in reserve, the latter reaching to Vetitos. During the night, however, Thomas received word from Baird on his extreme left, that his line did not extend to the road to Reed's Bridge as had been anticipated. So Rosecrans, at Thomas's request, hurried Negley over to the extreme left, and sent Wood's division to occupy the position thus vacated. As will appear later, this change led to the catastrophe which overwhelmed the Federals. The Confederate line was wholly east of the Lafayette road, the right and center being in close contact with the Union line. In order from right to left, it was arranged as follows: Breckinridge confronted Baird, extending beyond his left. Then in succession in the front line came the divisions of Cleburne, Stewart, Johnson, Hindman, and Preston. In reserve in rear of Breckinridge were the 2 divisions of Walker's corps; in rear of Cleburne and Stewart, the 5 brigades of Cheatham; and in column just behind Johnson, opposite Brotherton's, the divisions of Hood and Kershaw. The divisions of Hindman and Preston prolonged the line beyond the right of the Federals, who were thus overlapped on both flanks. Bragg had therefore 5 divisions, 15 brigades of infantry in reserve; besides 2 divisions of cavalry who were between the Union left and Granger's reserve corps at McAfee Church. Rosecrans had in reserve only Wilder's brigade and 2 brigades of Van Cleve. The first Confederate assault, made by the divisions of Breckinridge and Cleburne, fell on Negley and Baird at the extreme Union left, and was delivered with tremendous force. Thomas hurried up reinforcements from the right of his line, which checked the assault and finally drove the enemy back. The attack on Baird was followed by assaults which successively struck Johnson, Palmer, and Reynolds with equal fierceness, but all were gallantly repulsed. At last Bragg abandoned the attempt, and his troops fell back to their first positions. End of Part 1. 14. January to September, 1863. Chickamauga. Part 2. About 11 o'clock, Longstreet appealed to Bragg for permission to attack with his entire wing, and consent being given, prepared for a general advance. At nearly this same hour, an aide on Thomas's staff, who had been riding the lines, reported that there was a long gap in the line between Reynolds and Wood. This was not correct, as Brannan's division, although not in front line, was still in position, retired a short distance back, and concealed by the thick woods. This information was sent to Rosecrans, who dictated a message to Wood. "The general commanding directs that you close up on Reynolds as fast as possible, and support him." The order to Wood was dictated by General Rosecrans to Bond of his staff, and handed to Colonel Starling, Crittenden's chief of staff, for transmission. That officer, in his own words, "hesitated, not understanding the object of the order, when General Garfield called out that the object of the order was, that General Wood should occupy the vacancy made by the removal of Brannan's division, Brannan having been ordered to Thomas's left." If Garfield had written the order, he would, after his almost invariable custom, have included the explanatory phrase, but as it was, the order was absolutely peremptory. Wood could not understand this order, which it was impossible for him to execute literally, but he did not ask for any explanations, and undertook, in spite of the staff officer's protest, to carry it out as well as he could. The withdrawal of his command from the front left a gap of 2 brigades in the line of battle. Into this gap, which he would have sacrificed a division to create, Longstreet poured the divisions of Stewart, Johnson, Hindman, Hood, Kershaw, with Preston's large division in support. The Union right, already depleted to sustain Thomas, was almost annihilated. Several thousand prisoners were lost, with 40 guns and a large number of wagon trains. Davis, overpowered by numbers, was compelled to retire to save his command. One of Van Cleve's and 2 of Sheridan's brigades had already been sent to Thomas, but 5 brigades on the right were entirely cut off. Davis returned to the field at sundown. Sheridan rallied part of his command, moved by way of McFarland's Gap to Rossville, and thence marched back toward the battlefield. As Rosecrans, McCook, and Crittenden were caught in the break of the right, and went to Chattanooga, Thomas was left in command on the field. A part of the remnants of the Union right rallied at Snodgrass Hill, which should more properly be designated as Horseshoe Ridge. It is not a single hill, but a ridge composed of 3 distinct hills, jutting out eastward from Missionary Ridge, and lying at Worth, the valley of the Chickamauga, with the concavity of its crescent-shaped curve opening directly toward the south. It is situated west of the Lafayette road, about 2/3 of a mile from Kelly Field, and just south of the present military post of Fort Oglethorpe in Chickamauga Park. The distance from the Horseshoe to McFarland's Gap is about 2 miles and a half, and by this gap to Rossville nearly 6 miles. About 1 o'clock Brannan withdrew his line to this position, and Stanley's brigade of Negley rallied on his left, these two commands occupying the two westerly hills of the Horseshoe Ridge. Harker's brigade of Wood, after repulsing part of Longstreet's column which was moving toward the ridge, finally took position on the easterly hill in front of the Snodgrass house, on Stanley's left. Soon after 1 o'clock, Longstreet began his assaults on the Horseshoe with the brigades of Anderson, Hindman, and Kershaw, McLaws. By 2 o'clock the Confederates had passed over the hill on Brannan's right, and gained the valley in his rear. 3 miles away, near Rossville Gap, Gordon Granger was stationed with 3 brigades of the Reserve Corps. He had listened all the morning to the heavy firing to the south, which seemed to increase in intensity as the day wore on. Judging that Thomas was being hard pressed, he now decided, against orders, to march to the sound of the cannon. Placing Dan McCook's brigade at the McAfee Church to protect the Ringgold road, he started for the front with his 2 remaining brigades. Marching at double quick, Granger arrived about 2 o'clock at the most critical hour of the day, when Longstreet was forming the divisions of Hindman and Johnson in heavy columns for an assault on the right flank and rear of the Union position. Granger promptly hurled his 2 brigades, under Whittaker and Mitchell, against the threatening force. After a terrific conflict, which lasted only about 20 minutes, the Confederates were put to flight. The victory was won at fearful cost, but the army was saved. The enemy was driven from Brannan's right and rear, and the Union line was extended south 3/4 of a mile to the heights overlooking Vitito's. Immediately after, Van der Veer's brigade of Brannan's division came up from the Kelly Field and strengthened his right, and Hazen's brigade, brought from Palmer's line, took position on Harker's left. The Kelly Field line, where the 4 divisions still stood fast, now formed Thomas's left. The Horseshoe, with 5 brigades and some remnants of regiments, his right. Dan McCook's brigade, left by Granger, was on the high ground northwest of and overlooking Baird's left. On his way to the Horseshoe, Steedman, in command of Whittaker's and Mitchell's brigades of the Reserve Corps, had retaken the Union Hospital at Cloud Spring, captured about noon by Forrest's cavalry. Longstreet had 11 brigades for his assaults on the Horseshoe. The final charges covered a period of nearly 2 hours. At 3 o'clock he asked Bragg for some troops of the right wing, but was informed by him that they had been beaten back so badly that they could be of no service. In the meantime, Bragg had personally superintended the preparations for another assault on the Kelly Field line in even greater force. This attack, which was made with Walker's corps and the divisions of Breckinridge and Cleburne, was repulsed by the divisions of Baird, Johnson, and Palmer. But later in the afternoon Bragg succeeded in reaching the Lafayette road at McDonald's, in the rear of the Union army. In the debacle of the right, 2 brigades of Davis's division, 1 of Van Cleve's, and 2 of Sheridan's, were cut off from any communication with Thomas except by a long detour by the way of Dry Valley Road to Rossville, and then back to the Lafayette road. A part of these troops tried to join Thomas, and were placed along the road from Rossville to the battlefield. When Longstreet's men poured through the gap in the Union line, Rosecrans was on the right, near the rear of Davis. He was swept away with the tide of defeat, and finally reached Rossville with Garfield, his chief of staff. There, after a consultation with Garfield, he decided to send the latter back to Thomas, while he went himself to Chattanooga to make preparations for his troops as they came back en route. This act practically ruined the fine reputation of Rosecrans. In this campaign from Tullahoma to Chickamauga, Rosecrans had shown great ability, and but for the unfortunate order given to Wood during the battle he would doubtless have defeated Bragg, and won undying fame. It was a sad ending to a glorious career. During the whole afternoon there was a gap of nearly half a mile between Thomas's right on the Horseshoe and his left at Kelly's Field, which was a constant anxiety to him and his generals. Longstreet, who was directing the Confederate assaults from his headquarters in the Dyer field, entirely neglected this opportunity to move directly forward along the Lafayette road and cut the Union line in two. His object seems to have been, not so much to drive an entering wedge between the two wings, as to prevent the Federal left at the Kelly field from reinforcing that part of the army posted on the Horseshoe Ridge. During the afternoon of the second day 3 important dispatches were sent, which have excited much controversy. These are given below in their chronological order. Garfield to Rosecrans. General Thomas's headquarters, Battlefield, 5 miles south of Rossville. September 20, 1863, 3:45 P.M. General Rosecrans: I arrived here 10 minutes ago, via Rossville. I hope General Thomas will be able to hold on here till night, and will not need to fall back farther than Rossville. Perhaps not any. This dispatch was sent from the headquarters of General Thomas, near the Snodgrass House, on Horseshoe Ridge. At about 4:30 P.M., Thomas received the first order from Rosecrans to withdraw his troops. Up to that time, as the ranking general on the field, he had resolutely maintained his position. This order, which was received soon after Garfield had reported, read as follows: Rosecrans to Thomas, Headquarters Department of the Cumberland, Chattanooga, September 20, 1863, 12:15 P.M. Major General Thomas: Assume command of all the forces, and with Crittenden and McCook take a strong position and assume a threatening attitude at Rossville. W. S. Rosecrans, Major General. When General Thomas was preparing his official report of the 30th of September, he called the attention of General Rosecrans to the alleged sending time of this order, 12:15 P.M., and the latter said it was an error; that he "did not leave the battlefield until after that hour, nor reach Chattanooga before 3:40 P.M." We know that Rosecrans was on the battlefield until after midday. He then rode to Chattanooga over 10 miles, stopping en route at Rossville for a long conference with Garfield. It would therefore seem physically impossible for him to have reached Chattanooga before 3:30 or 4 o'clock. He afterwards stated that the dispatch "must have been written as late as 4:15 P.M." This hour, however, seems too late, as Thomas began his withdrawal about 4:30. Rosecrans' second dispatch of the same purport was addressed to Garfield, and read as follows: Rosecrans to Garfield, Chattanooga, September 20th, 1863. Brigadier General Garfield: See General McCook and other general officers. Ascertain extent of disaster, as nearly as you can, and report. Tell General Granger to contest the enemy's advance stubbornly, making them advance with caution. Should General Thomas be retiring in order, tell him to resist the enemy's advance, retiring on Rossville to night. According to Thomas's report, this second dispatch was given him by Garfield at a point beyond the Ridge Road, which runs from the battlefield to McFarland's Gap, on his way from the field, whence he proceeded to Rossville, accompanied by Generals Garfield and Gordon Granger. From other reports it seems certain that the exact point was the Cloud House, near the Lafayette road, about 2 miles from the Snodgrass House, and the time a little after sunset, that is to say, soon after 6 o'clock. Soon after Thomas received Rosecrans' first dispatch, addressed to himself, ordering withdrawal, he sent an aide to Reynolds to direct the beginning of the movement. At the same time, orders were dispatched to the other left wing division commanders for their withdrawal successively. Reynolds, who was in danger of being cut off, had already begun to retire before receiving Thomas's order. He was joined on the Lafayette road by Thomas, who had left the Snodgrass House a little before 5. Thomas then took personal charge of the movement, and directed the troops to withdraw by way of McFarland's Gap. Misunderstanding Thomas's order, Reynolds marched directly along the Lafayette road toward Rossville Gap, until checked at Cloud Church by Forrest's cavalry, while Thomas, separating King's brigade from the rest of the division, wheeled to the left near McDonald's and took the Ridge Road to McFarland's Gap. Here he halted, and sent orders for the withdrawal of the troops on the Horseshoe, who, however, had been driven from their positions before the order arrived. The most direct line of retreat would have been by Rossville Gap, But Thomas obeyed literally the order of Rosecrans, and withdrew via McFarland's, in order to join his forces with Crittenden and McCook, whose troops were in that vicinity. As directed, he also assumed a threatening attitude, by forming a line from the Gap to the Lafayette road, to protect the withdrawal and check pursuit. This alignment was completed about 5:30, and shortly thereafter he received Rosecrans' second dispatch ordering him to retire on Rossville. The assaults by Anderson and Kershaw ceased about 4 o'clock, and Preston's two brigades of Buckner's corps made their final and successful attacks about 5. An hour later, the whole of the Horseshoe was in the possession of the Confederates; the last Federal stand being not on the main ridge, but over 300 yards north of it, on the bare hill near the Snodgrass house. "At the end of the battle, at the hour of sunset (6 P.M.), says General Buckner, the enemy was retreating hastily from every part of the field. About 6 o'clock, General Longstreet, in command of the Confederate left wing, halted the pursuit. A few minutes later the sun went down and the moon rose. It was a bright moonlight night. After nightfall, Thomas skillfully withdrew his command to Rossville, where ammunition and rations were sent him by Rosecrans from the city. Some attempts by the Confederates to interfere with this movement were repulsed without serious difficulty. So quietly was the army withdrawn that Bragg did not discover the retirement until the next morning. There was no object to be gained in holding the line at Rossville Gap beyond securing time to make the final arrangements for the withdrawal of the troops to Chattanooga, which was accomplished on the 21st. The following morning found the Army of the Cumberland in position before the city, and too strong to be attacked by the enemy with any chance of success. The name Chickamauga, in the Indian tongue, is said to mean Valley of Death, and the place had now fairly earned that somber epithet. Chickamauga was the most bloody battle of the Civil War, and also, with few exceptions, of modern times. The losses, as given by General Alexander, were as follows: Federals killed, 1,657; Confederates, 2,074; wounded Federals, 9,754; wounded Confederates, 12,797; Federals missing, 4,753; Confederates, 1,328. The total losses for the Federals was 16,164, and for the Confederates 16,199. It is hard to determine the exact numbers engaged on each side. Sist says, "The largest number of troops Rosecrans had of all arms on the field during the 2 days' fighting was 55,000 effective men," and that Bragg, during the battle, when his entire 5 corps were engaged, had about 70,000 effective troops in line. The figures given in battles and leaders are substantially the same. Federals, 56,965 of all arms; Confederates, 71,551 of all arms. Livermore estimates the Union effectives at 58,000, and the Confederates at 66,000. General Alexander gives the following figures: Federals, 55,799 infantry and artillery, and 9,842 cavalry; total, 65,641. Confederates, 47,520 infantry and artillery, and 14,260 cavalry; total, 61,780. There were probably about 125,000 men on both sides engaged in the battle, and the total losses in killed, wounded, and missing were about 32,000. If we deduct from the total forces the 24,000 cavalry, in which the casualties were very light, we find that the losses in the 2 other arms were about 32%, or nearly 1/3 of those engaged. If we exclude prisoners, the losses in killed and wounded were about 27%. To paint a battle, says Victor Hugo, would require one of those powerful artists who has chaos in his brush. The historian narrates the features which strike him in this pêle mêle. The line of battle floats and twists like a rope stretched across a swift current; the fronts of the armies move forward and back; regiments advancing or retiring make promontories or indentations. There always arrives a certain moment when a battle degenerates into a combat, becomes particularized, and is resolved into innumerable details, which, to borrow the expression of Napoleon, belong rather to the biography of regiments than to the history of the army. In this case the historian evidently has the right to give a résumé. He can seize only the outstanding features of the combat; no narrator, however conscientious, has the gift to fix absolutely the form of that horrible haze which we call a battle. This, which is true of all great combats, is applicable particularly to Chickamauga. Chickamauga, says Judge Turgot, was a battle almost unparalleled in modern times. Volumes have been written to prove how those who fought were marshalled. Such efforts are mostly vain. Confusion grows more confounded with each attempt to reduce order out of impenetrable chaos. Other authors have also had to confess the impossibility of making up a clear and true account from the published material. But, although the details of the battle are very complicated, the salient points are not difficult to understand. The trouble has been that nearly all of the earlier histories were based, not upon official authority, but upon unreliable newspaper stories, and that until recently no true and complete account of the battle has been written. None of the histories published prior to 1889 were based on official facts, as the official records had not then been published. The reports written by 215 Federal and 199 Confederate officers have since been printed, and fill nearly 4 volumes of about 1,000 pages each. The misinformation began in the "complimentary orders" issued to his troops by General Rosecrans on the 2d of October, 1863. He wrote: "When the day closed you held the field, from which you withdrew in the face of the overpowering numbers, to occupy the point for which you set out, Chattanooga." Here are recorded 3 statements of alleged fact, not one of which is supported by the records. 1. When the day closed, the field was abandoned by the Federals. 2. The records show that Rosecrans had about 60,000 men in the battle and Bragg about 65,000. 3. The battle was not fought to gain possession of Chattanooga, which Rosecrans might have occupied on the 9th of September without opposition. The facts are more correctly stated in Rosecrans' telegram to President Lincoln from Chattanooga, at 9 A.M. on Monday, the 21st of September. "After 2 days of the severest fighting I ever witnessed, our right and center were beaten. The left wing held its position until sunset, 6 o'clock. We have no certainty of holding our position here." Thomas received about 4:30 the order from Rosecrans to withdraw his troops from the battlefield. He was then holding the Horseshoe with some remnants from the right wing, and the Kelly field with the divisions of Reynolds, Palmer, Johnson, Baird, and Barnes' brigade of Van Cleve. He began the movement at once by dispatching orders to Reynolds and his other left wing division commanders for their withdrawal successively, from right to left. Thus General Thomas quit when ordered, and because he was ordered. Through a misunderstanding of Thomas's orders, as stated above, Reynolds moved straight along the Lafayette road toward Rossville, while the other divisions took the Ridge road, as intended, toward McFarland's Gap. Thomas formed his divisions to resist pursuit in a line from the head of McFarland's Gap to the Lafayette road and the Cloud House, nearly to Rossville Gap. This formation was completed about 5:30. At that hour the Horseshoe Ridge was in the possession of the enemy. At this same hour, in the vicinity of the Cloud House, Sheridan reported his arrival on Thomas's left. This brave general had accomplished a feat almost unique in the annals of war. After the dispersal of his division by the onslaught of Longstreet on the Union right, and the loss of 30% of his command, he had gathered and rallied together in the woods more than half of the scattered remnants, about 1,500 men, and brought them into line again at the extreme left flank, ready for action before sunset. It thus appears that there is little or no truth in the 3 popular fallacies regarding Thomas's connection with the battle, which may be specified as follows: 1. That the troops who remained with him were all members of his own 14th Corps. 2. That he used his own discretion, and did not immediately withdraw his men on receiving Rosecrans' order. 3. that he held Horseshoe Ridge until nightfall, 7:30, and then marched his men from the battlefield in perfect order. The facts, as conclusively proved by the official records, are: 1. That the troops under Thomas's orders who held the Kelly Field and the Horseshoe were composed of all the different corps of the Army of the Cumberland. 2. That on the receipt of Rosecrans' order, about 4:30, Thomas immediately issued his orders for the withdrawal. 3. That his troops were so much disorganized, he considered it futile to attempt to make a stand in front of the two gaps. What is said above is not meant in any sense as a criticism of General Thomas. He did his full duty. He inspired his men with courage and confidence, and his conduct deserves only words of praise. He was in no way responsible for the Federal defeat, and was powerless to avert the disaster. He took no steps to withdraw his men until he received direct orders from the commander in chief to retire. Although he did not retreat to the famous Horseshoe Ridge, and there stand at bay, for 6 weary hours, while with 25,000 men, he hurled back again and again the furious onset of 60,000 rebels mad with desire to clutch the prize they had so nearly won, he none the less deserved his title of the Rock of Chickamauga. He could not prevent the Federal defeat, but he saved the army from destruction. General Syst says that the campaign of Chickamauga, taking everything into consideration, was "the most brilliant one of the war." Up to the time of Bragg's withdrawal from Chattanooga, Rosecrans' manoeuvres were masterly, but then he was utterly deceived. Bragg never intended his retirement to be permanent. All the indications he left behind proved that. No bridges were destroyed. All hospitals, storehouses, and other buildings used by his army were left standing. Yet Rosecrans was duped by one of the oldest and most common ruses de guerre, and believed the tales of deserters, that the Confederate army was retreating in utter demoralization. His first mistake was in scattering his army in pursuit before this fact was definitely determined, and the difficulty in again concentrating his troops forced him to fight at Chickamauga. Had Bragg received his promised reinforcements at the date he expected them, the Union army would have been completely crushed in detail. While the Confederates gained some slight advantages in the battle of the 19th, there was nothing to indicate that they could finally defeat the Federals. Their victory on the second day was due mainly to Rosecrans' orders to Wood, given under a misapprehension, and which so experienced a soldier should never have executed without question. General Wood was a graduate of West Point, had been in the army all his life, and knew the full meaning of all technical terms used to describe military movements. He must have realized that there was some error in the order to "close up on Reynolds," for he carefully put away the order in his note book with the remark that he "was glad the order was in writing, as it was a good thing to have for future reference." He was apparently irritated over a reprimand received from Rosecrans earlier in the day, and undertook the execution of an impossible order, rather than ask an explanation of it from the general in command. To this extent he was responsible for the disaster which overwhelmed the Union army. In justice to General Wood, however, it should be added that after he reported to Thomas, "there was no more splendid fighting done" than was done by Thomas J. Wood and his division. To the last he aided Thomas in holding Horseshoe Ridge, and his was one of the last divisions to retire. Rosecrans' final error was in not returning personally to the battlefield instead of sending Garfield. As at Murfreesboro, he might have done much to restore the morale of his troops, and pluck victory from defeat. Thomas was a stubborn fighter, but he lacked the personal magnetism of Rosecrans. "That was the turning point," says Syst, "and his hour had arrived." The hero of Chickamauga was George H. Thomas, and well was it for the Army of the Cumberland that he was in command of the left on that day. Carefully posting his troops, he stood at bay, with his back to the wall, and refused to be driven from the field. Here he stayed, repulsing every attack until ordered to withdraw. He fully earned his glorious title of the Rock of Chickamauga. End of Chapter 14.